Hey there, welcome back to Whispers of RPG. Ready to uncover some incredible stories hidden deep within your favorite games? Today, we're setting off on a thrilling adventure into the shadowy world of Lord Gwyn, where we'll explore the heartbreaking tale of the four kings of New Londo. Ever wondered how noble rulers ended up falling into darkness? Over the next few hours, we'll reveal their mysterious rise, their tragic corruption by the sinister Darkstalker Kaathe, and the chilling fallout of their choices. From loyal allies of Lord Gwyn to fearsome leaders of the Darkwraiths, we'll dig into every twist and turn of their saga. So, grab your gear, get comfy, and let's dive into this unforgettable legend from Dark Souls together. NDS Chapter 1: The Golden Age of New Londo. In the early days of the Age of Fire, when Lord Gwyn's light cast away the ancient darkness and brought order to the world, there existed a magnificent city called New Londo, built in close proximity to the grand city of the gods, Londo. New Londo represented the pinnacle of human achievement in Lord Gwyn. Its towers reached toward the heavens. Its architecture rivaled that of the gods themselves, and its culture flourished under the guidance of four exceptional leaders. These four rulers were not born to nobility through bloodline or birthright. Rather, they earned their positions through exceptional wisdom, foresight, and leadership. Their names have been lost to history, consumed by the very darkness they would eventually embrace. But their titles remain: the four kings of New Londo. Each king brought unique strengths to their shared rule, creating a harmonious balance that allowed their city to prosper beyond imagination. The first king was known for his strategic brilliance, capable of seeing patterns in politics and warfare that eluded others. His counsel guided New Londo through numerous conflicts, ensuring the city's survival and growth during turbulent times. The second king possessed an unmatched understanding of human nature, able to mediate disputes and bring peace to warring factions. His wisdom in governance created laws that were both just and practical, earning the love and respect of his subjects. The third king was a master of commerce and trade, understanding the flow of resources and wealth better than any merchant. Under his guidance, New Londo became a hub of economic activity, its markets bustling with traders from across Lord Gwyn. The fourth king was perhaps the most mysterious, known for his deep knowledge of magic and the mysteries of the soul. His research into the nature of humanity and the power that dwelt within human souls would later prove to be both a blessing and a curse. Together, these four rulers created a golden age for New Londo. The city's citizens enjoyed prosperity, security, and freedom. Art and culture flourished with great works of architecture, sculpture, and literature, emerging from the creative minds of New Londo's inhabitants. The city's scholars made groundbreaking discoveries in magic and technology, while its soldiers were renowned throughout Lord Gwyn for their courage and skill. It was during this golden age that Lord Gwyn himself took notice of New Londo and its remarkable rulers. The Lord of Sunlight, impressed by their wisdom and the prosperity they had brought to their people, made a decision that would forever alter the course of their destiny. In recognition of their exceptional leadership and foresight, Gwyn offered the four kings a gift beyond measure: fragments of his own Lord Soul. This was no small honor. Lord Souls were among the most powerful forces in existence, remnants of the first flame that had brought light and disparity to the world. Gwyn himself possessed one of these mighty souls, as did the Witch of Izalith, Grallard Nido, and the furtive pygmy, by sharing portions of his own soul with the four kings. Gwyn was not only granting them immense power, but also acknowledging them as equals in the hierarchy of Lordran. The granting of these soul fragments came with both power and responsibility. The kings were now bound to Gwyn's vision of order, tasked with maintaining the Age of Fire and protecting their realm from the encroaching darkness. They accepted this burden willingly, seeing it as both an honor and a duty to their people. The fragments of the Lord's soul enhance their already considerable abilities, allowing them to rule with even greater wisdom and strength. With their newfound power, the four kings transformed New Londo into something even more magnificent. The city's defenses became impregnable, its magic more potent, and its influence more far-reaching. They established trade routes that connected distant lands, brought peace to warring regions, and created a network of alliances that strengthened the realm against external threats. But perhaps most importantly, the four kings used their power to better understand their subjects. The fragments of the Lord's soul granted them insight into the nature of human souls, allowing them to perceive the hopes, fears, and desires of their people with unprecedented clarity. This understanding made them even more effective rulers, able to anticipate problems before they arose and address the needs of their citizens with precision and compassion. The golden age of New Londo lasted for many years, a shining example of what humans could achieve when blessed with divine power and guided by wise leadership. The city became a beacon of hope and progress, its influence spreading throughout Lordaeron. Pilgrims traveled from distant lands to witness its marvels. Scholars came to study in its libraries, and warriors sought training from its masters. Yet, even during these halcyon days, there were whispers of darker forces stirring in the depths below the city, ancient powers that predated even the Age of Fire lay dormant beneath New Londo's foundations, and the very prosperity the city enjoyed seemed to draw the attention of entities that dwelt in shadow. The four kings, blessed with the power of the Lord's soul, remained confident in their ability to protect their realm from any threat. Little did they know that their greatest enemy would not come from without, but would instead arrive in the form of a smooth-tongued serpent bearing gifts of forbidden knowledge. The golden age of New London was nearing its end, though none could have foreseen the catastrophic events that would soon unfold. The peace and prosperity that had defined New Londo for so long had perhaps made its rulers complacent. They had grown accustomed to their power, confident in their ability to handle any challenge that might arise. The fragments of the Lord's soul had granted them great strength, but they had also planted the seeds of hubris. When the time came for their greatest test, this confidence would prove to be their undoing. As we look back on this golden age, we can see the tragic irony that would define the tale of the four kings. Their very success, their wisdom, and their power would make them attractive targets for corruption. The heights they achieved would make their eventual fall all the more devastating, not just for themselves, but for every soul that called New Londo home. Chapter 2. The arrival of Darkstalker Kaathe into this realm of light and prosperity came a being as ancient as the world itself, a creature that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless ages. Darkstalker Kaathe, one of the primordial serpents, slithered through the shadows beneath New Londo with purpose dark and terrible. Unlike his counterpart, King Seeker Frampt, who served Lord Gwyn's vision of perpetual fire, Kaathe harbored different ambitions entirely. He sought to bring about the Age of Dark, to see humanity claim its rightful place as rulers of the world. The primordial serpents were beings of immense age and cunning, possessing knowledge that spanned eons. They understood the true nature of the cycle that governed the world, the endless alternation between ages of fire and ages of dark. Frampt worked to maintain Gwyn's artificial extension of the Age of Fire, but Kaathe saw this as a perversion of the natural order. He believed that humanity deserved to inherit the world, to claim the dark soul that was their birthright and usher in a new age of human dominance. Kaathe had spent countless years searching for the perfect agents to carry out his vision. He needed individuals with both the power to challenge the established order and the authority to lead others into darkness. The four kings of New Londo, blessed with fragments of a Lord's soul, and ruling over one of the greatest human civilizations in Lifedrain, were ideal candidates for his purposes. The serpent did not approach the kings directly at first. Instead, he observed them from the shadows, studying their personalities, their desires, and their weaknesses. He watched as they ruled with wisdom and compassion, noting how their fragments of the Lord's soul had enhanced their understanding of human nature. This very gift would become the key to their corruption. For Kaathe understood that the deepest knowledge often comes with the darkest temptations. When Kaathe finally revealed himself to the four kings, he did not appear as a tempter or corrupter. Instead, he presented himself as a teacher, a keeper of ancient wisdom who had come to share profound truths about the nature of existence. His words were carefully chosen, designed to appeal to the king's intellect and their desire to better serve their people. He spoke of hidden knowledge of powers that could help them achieve even greater things for their realm. The serpent began by revealing the true history of the world, telling the kings of the age of ancients that had preceded the age of fire. He spoke of the everlasting dragons that had once ruled in a gray twilight without disparity, without light or dark, heat or cold, life or death. He explained how the discovery of the first flame had brought change to this static world, granting souls to those who found them, and beginning the cycle of ages that governed existence. Most crucially, CTH revealed the existence of the dark soul, the fourth soul discovered by the furtive pygmy. While Gwyn, the Witch of Islith, and Nito had claimed the powerful Lord souls of light, life, and death, respectively, the pygmy had found something different, a soul of darkness that was the birthright of all humanity. This dark soul, CTH explained, was what made humans unique among the inhabitants of Lordran. It was the source of their humanity, their potential for growth and change. The four kings listened with growing fascination as CTH wove his tale. The serpent explained that Gwyn, fearing the power of the dark soul and the potential of humanity, had worked to suppress this knowledge. The Lord of Sunlight had branded humans with the dark sign, a curse that prevented them from fully accessing their dark heritage. He had established the age of fire not out of benevolence, but out of fear of what humans might become if they embraced their true nature. According to CTH, the fragments of the Lord's soul that the four kings possessed were both a gift and a chain. While they granted power, they also bound the kings to Gwyn's vision of eternal fire. The serpent suggested that there were other sources of power, older and more fundamental than the artificial light of the first flame. He spoke of the abyss, the deepest darkness that existed below all things, and hinted at the powers that could be drawn from its depths. The art of Lifedrain was Ko's ultimate temptation. This forbidden technique, he explained, would allow the kings to directly draw upon the humanity of others, absorbing their life force and adding it to their own power. It was, the serpent claimed, humanity's true birthright, the ability to consume and grow stronger, to evolve beyond the limitations imposed by the gods. Through Lifedrain, they could transcend their current existence and become something greater. CTH was careful to present this not as a corruption, but as an enlightenment. He framed the technique as a return to humanity's natural state, a casting off of the artificial constraints imposed by divine authority. The four kings, he argued, owed it to their people to explore every avenue of power that might benefit their realm. How could they truly protect and guide their subjects if they limited themselves to only the knowledge that Gwyn deemed acceptable. The serpent's arguments were seductive precisely because they contained elements of truth. The four kings could sense the sincerity in CTH's words, the genuine belief that he was offering them a path to greater wisdom and power. His knowledge of ancient history was profound and accurate, lending credibility to his more controversial claims. Most importantly, his offer seemed to align with their own noble goals of better serving their people. The process of corruption was gradual and subtle. CTH did not ask the kings to abandon their principles or betray their subjects immediately. Instead, he suggested small experiments, minor applications of the forbidden knowledge he offered. Perhaps they could use a touch of Lifedrain to heal a dying subject, drawing death from them and replacing it with vitality. Or they might employ these techniques to better understand the nature of the human souls under their care. Each small step seemed reasonable and justified. Each application of dark knowledge appeared to serve a noble purpose. The four kings told themselves that they were merely expanding their understanding, exploring new methods of rulership that could benefit their people. They maintained their roles as benevolent leaders while secretly delving deeper into the mysteries that CTH revealed. But darkness has a way of spreading, of taking root in the soul and growing beyond its intended bounds. The more the four kings experimented with Lifedrain, the more they began to crave its power. What started as academic curiosity evolved into something more sinister. They found themselves drawing upon the humanity of their subjects, not out of necessity, but for the sheer pleasure of the sensation. The art of Lifedrain was intoxicating in ways the kings had never imagined. Each absorbed soul brought with it memories, experiences, and emotions that enriched their own existence. They began to understand their subjects in ways that went far beyond their previous empathetic leadership. They could literally feel what their people felt, know what they knew, experience their joys and sorrows as if they were their own. This intimate connection with their subjects' souls gradually shifted their perspective on rulership. Why settle for guiding and protecting their people when they could become one with them? Why limit themselves to the role of external leaders when they could incorporate their subjects' very essence into their own being? The line between ruler and ruled began to blur as the kings embraced their growing hunger for human souls. CTH watched these developments with satisfaction, seeing his carefully laid plans coming to fruition. The four kings were transforming exactly as he had hoped, evolving from benevolent rulers into something far more useful for his purposes. Soon, they would be ready for the final stage of their corruption, the complete embrace of the abyss that would make them perfect servants of the Age of Dark. Chapter 3: The Descent into Darkness. As the four kings delved deeper into the forbidden arts taught by Darkstalker Kaathe, the very nature of their rule began to change. What had once been a golden age of prosperity and wisdom gradually transformed into something far more sinister. The king's experiments with Lifedrain grew bolder and more frequent, and their hunger for human souls became an insatiable craving that consumed their thoughts and guided their actions. The transformation was not immediately apparent to the citizens of New Londo. The kings were careful to maintain their public facade, continuing to issue wise proclamations and appear before their subjects with the same benevolent demeanor they had always shown. But those who served them closely began to notice subtle changes. Advisors reported that the kings seemed distracted during council meetings. Their attention focused on something beyond the matters at hand. Guards whispered of strange sounds emanating from the royal quarters during the darkest hours of night. The physical transformation of the kings themselves was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of their corruption. The fragments of the Lord's soul that had once enhanced their humanity now battled against the dark forces they were embracing. Their bodies began to change, taking on a gray, bark-like texture that spoke of their growing connection to the abyss. Root-like protrusions emerged from their flesh, particularly around their hearts, where the dark sign had taken hold. These growths spread across their bodies like the branches of some unholy tree, marking them as creatures caught between light and darkness. The king's eyes, once bright with wisdom and compassion, became clouded and distant. When they looked upon their subjects now, they no longer saw individuals to be protected and guided. Instead, they saw vessels of humanity waiting to be harvested, sources of power that could fuel their growing strength. The fragments of the Lord's soul that resided within them began to conflict with the dark energies they were absorbing, creating an internal struggle that manifested in increasingly erratic behavior. As their hunger grew, the kings began to recruit others to their cause. The most loyal soldiers and courtiers were gradually inducted into the mysteries of Lifedrain, becoming the first Darkwraiths. These knights, once proud defenders of New Londo's peace and prosperity, were transformed into something altogether different. Clad in dark armor and wielding weapons designed to drain the life from their enemies, they became extensions of their master's will, instruments through which the kings could satisfy their growing hunger for human souls. The creation of the Darkwraiths marked a turning point in New Londo's history. No longer content with the occasional secret application of Lifedrain, the kings now had an entire order of knights dedicated to the practice. These dark wraiths were sent forth from the city on missions that ostensibly served diplomatic or military purposes. But their true objective was always the same: to harvest humanity from the populations they encountered. The art of Lifedrain itself evolved as the kings and their servants perfected their techniques. What had begun as a crude method of absorbing life force developed into a sophisticated practice that could drain not just a victim's humanity, but their memories, skills, and even their capacity for independent thought. The Darkwraiths became master practitioners of this art, able to reduce once proud warriors to hollow shells with nothing more than a touch of their dark magic. The transformation of New Londo's military was accompanied by changes in the city's governance. Laws that had once protected the rights and freedoms of citizens were gradually altered to give the kings greater authority over their subjects' lives. Curfews were implemented supposedly for public safety, but actually to provide cover for the Darkwraith's nocturnal activities. Citizens began to disappear, their absence explained away as voluntary departures or unfortunate accidents. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the way the kings began to view their own subjects. The bonds of loyalty and affection that had once characterized their rule were replaced by a cold calculation of utility. Citizens were evaluated not based on their contributions to society or their personal worth, but on the quality and quantity of humanity they possessed. Those with strong souls were marked for eventual harvesting, while those with weak or damaged souls were dismissed as worthless. The corruption spread beyond the royal court and its immediate servants. As the kings embraced their dark nature more fully, the very atmosphere of New Londo began to change. The city's once bright streets grew darker, not just in terms of illumination, but in the oppressive sense of dread that seemed to permeate every corner. Citizens reported strange dreams and nightmares, visions of darkness rising from beneath the city to consume everything in its path. The abyss itself began to take notice of what was happening in New Londo. This primordial darkness, which existed below all things, was drawn to the growing corruption in the city like a moth to flame. The king's experiments with Lifedrain and their increasing hunger for human souls created a kind of resonance with the deepest darkness, calling it up from the depths where it had slumbered since before the age of fire. As the abyss stirred, its influence began to manifest in increasingly obvious ways throughout New Londo. Shadows moved of their own accord, defying the laws of light and physics. The city's sewers and lower levels became breeding grounds for creatures of darkness, beings that fed on despair and multiplied in the absence of hope. The very foundations of the city began to weaken as the abyss pressed upward, seeking to reclaim the surface world. The four kings welcomed these changes, seeing them as signs of their growing power and evidence that they were on the correct path. CTH had taught them that the abyss was not something to be feared, but rather humanity's natural home. In the deepest darkness, he claimed, humans would find their true strength and claim their rightful place as the dominant force in the world. The The kings believed that by embracing the abyss, they were preparing their city and their people for a glorious future. But the abyss is not a force that can be controlled or directed by mortal will. No matter how enhanced by fragments of a Lord's soul. As the darkness grew stronger in New Londo, it began to exert its own influence over the kings and their servants. The Darkwraiths, originally created to serve their master's purposes, began to act according to their own dark impulses. The corruption that had started as a tool for achieving greater power became an end in itself, a consuming hunger that could never be satisfied. The kings found themselves changing in ways they had not anticipated. Their memories of their former selves grew dim, replaced by an overwhelming focus on the acquisition of souls and the spread of darkness. The fragments of the Lord's soul within them struggled against this corruption, creating internal conflicts that manifested as periods of lucidity followed by descents into madness. They retained enough of their former intelligence to continue their schemes, but their motivations had become alien even to themselves. The city's scholars and mages, once proud practitioners of the illuminating arts, found their research taking darker turns. Magic that had once been used to heal and protect was twisted into forms designed to harm and corrupt. The great libraries of New Londo began to fill with forbidden texts and dark rituals, knowledge that would have been considered abhorrent in earlier times, but now seemed like natural extensions of the king's new philosophy. Trade with other cities and regions began to suffer as New Londo's merchants and diplomats carried the taint of corruption with them wherever they went. Other rulers grew suspicious of New London's representatives, sensing something wrong in their words and manner, even if they could not identify the exact nature of the threat. Gradually, the city became isolated, cut off from the networks of alliance and commerce that had once been the source of its strength. The citizens of New Londo lived in growing fear, though many could not articulate the source of their unease. The city that had once been their pride and joy was becoming something alien and threatening. Some attempted to flee, but the kings had grown paranoid about preserving the secrecy of their transformation. Few who tried to leave the city were ever seen again. Their humanity harvested to fuel the dark engines of their former protector's ambition. As the corruption reached its zenith, the very nature of reality within New Londo began to shift. The boundaries between the physical world and the abyss grew thin, allowing creatures of pure darkness to manifest among the living. Time itself seemed to flow differently in certain parts of the city, with some areas experiencing rapid decay, while others remained frozen in moments of particular despair or terror. The four kings had achieved their goal of transcending their original limitations, but the price had been higher than they could have imagined. they had become something far removed from the wise and benevolent rulers they had once been, transformed into servants of a darkness that cared nothing for their original noble intentions. The golden age of New Londo was ending, and a nightmare was about to begin. Chapter 4: The Rise of the Darkwraiths. The transformation of New London's knights into Darkwraiths represented one of the most tragic aspects of the city's fall. These men and women had once been the finest warriors in Lordran, dedicated to protecting their city and its people with unwavering loyalty and courage. They had sworn oaths to defend the innocent, uphold justice, and serve their kings with honor. Now corrupted by the same dark forces that had claimed their masters, they became instruments of terror and oppression. The process of creating a Darkwraith was both physical and spiritual, requiring the complete corruption of a warrior's soul. It began with exposure to the art of Lifedrain, as the kings taught their most trusted knights the forbidden techniques that CTH had revealed. At first, these lessons were presented as advanced combat training, methods for defeating particularly dangerous enemies who might threaten the realm. The knights, trusting in their master's wisdom, accepted this instruction without question. The initial applications of Lifedrains seemed harmless enough. Knights were taught to draw upon the life force of fallen enemies to heal their own wounds, or to absorb the strength of defeated foes to enhance their own abilities. In the context of battle against genuinely evil adversaries, these techniques appeared to be reasonable additions to their arsenal. The knights told themselves that they were simply using the enemy's own power against them, turning darkness to the service of light. But the corruption inherent in Lifedrain could not be contained or controlled. Each use of the technique created a hunger for more, a craving that grew stronger with every application. Knights who had once been satisfied with victory in battle now found themselves seeking out conflicts for the sole purpose of harvesting the life force of their opponents. The line between protecting their city and feeding their growing addiction began to blur. The physical transformation of the knights paralleled that of their masters. Their armor, once bright and polished, began to darken as if stained by shadow itself. The metal took on a malevolent gleam, and intricate patterns of darkness seemed to writhe across its surface like living things. Their weapons underwent similar changes, becoming tools specifically designed for the harvesting of human souls rather than simple instruments of war. The most distinctive weapon of the Darkwraiths was the Dark Hand, a gauntlet-like device that allowed its wielder to reach directly into an opponent's chest and tear out their humanity. This weapon was both practical and symbolic, representing the Darkwraith's complete rejection of their former role as protectors. Where once they had used their hands to shield the innocent and offer aid to the fallen, now they use them to to steal the very essence of life from their victims. The psychological transformation of the Darkwraiths was perhaps even more disturbing than their physical changes. Warriors who had once been motivated by duty, honor, and compassion found themselves driven by an insatiable hunger for human souls. They began to view other people not as individuals deserving of protection, but as sources of nourishment to be harvested. The bonds of fellowship that had once united them were replaced by a shared dedication to their dark purpose. As their corruption deepened, the Darkwraiths developed new abilities that reflected their fallen nature. They could move through shadows as easily as walking through an open door, appearing suddenly behind their victims without warning. Their presence alone was enough to drain hope and courage from those around them, leaving potential opponents weakened and vulnerable before the battle even began. They could sense the strength of a person's humanity from great distances, allowing them to track particularly valuable targets across vast expanses of terrain. The Darkwraiths were not merely random predators seeking easy prey. Under the direction of the Four Kings, they operated with military precision and strategic intelligence. They were organized into ranks and units, each with specific responsibilities and areas of operation. Some specialized in infiltrating other cities and kingdoms, posing as merchants, diplomats, or mercenaries, while secretly harvesting souls from unsuspecting populations. Others focused on direct assault, overwhelming fortified positions through superior numbers and dark magic. The covenant that bound the Darkwraiths to their masters was more than just a military oath. It was a spiritual connection that linked their souls to the growing power of the abyss. This bond allowed the Four Kings to direct their servants' actions across great distances, coordinate complex operations involving multiple units, and share the strength gained from harvested souls among all members of the Covenant. The Darkwraiths became extensions of their master's will, able to act with perfect unity of purpose, even when scattered across the realm. The expansion of Darkwraith activities beyond New Londo marked the beginning of a dark chapter in the history of Lord Dan. These fallen knights spread across the land like a plague, establishing hidden enclaves in major cities and infiltrating important institutions. They targeted not just random civilians, but specifically sought out individuals whose souls would provide maximum benefit to their masters. Scholars, mages, priests, and other wielders of spiritual power became prime targets for their harvesting operations. The Darkwraiths developed sophisticated methods for identifying and tracking their prey. They could sense the quality of a person's soul from their emanations of humanity, allowing them to distinguish between targets worth pursuing and those that would provide minimal benefit. They learned to recognize the signs of spiritual strength, the way light reflected differently off certain individuals, subtle variations in shadow that indicated a particularly powerful soul, the unconscious reactions of animals and sensitive people to the presence of great humanity. Their hunting techniques evolved to become increasingly subtle and efficient. Rather than relying on brute force, experienced Darkwraiths learned to manipulate their victims psychologically, creating situations where their targets would willingly lower their defenses. They might pose as priests offering spiritual counsel, gradually draining their victims' souls during what appeared to be religious ceremonies. Or they could assume the roles of healers, using their victims' trust and vulnerability to gain access to their spiritual essence. The Covenant's power grew with each soul harvested, creating a feedback loop that accelerated the corruption of New Londo and its inhabitants. The Four Kings became stronger and more capable of influencing events across Lordran, while the Darkwraiths gained new abilities and resources that made them even more effective at their grim work. The darkness that had begun as a small seed planted by CTH's teachings now threatened to engulf the entire realm. The most disturbing aspect of the Darkwraith's operations was their complete lack of discrimination in choosing victims. Where once the Knights of New Londo had fought to protect the innocent and uphold justice, the Darkwraiths viewed all humanity as potential fuel for their masters' ambitions. Children, elderly people, pregnant women, clergy, scholars, artists, all were equally valid targets for soul harvesting. The only consideration was the strength of their humanity and the convenience of access. Some Darkwraiths specialized in mass harvesting operations, targeting densely populated areas where they could gather many souls quickly. They might infiltrate a festival or religious gathering, using the crowd's festive mood and lowered vigilance to their advantage. Others preferred to focus on high-value individual targets, spending weeks or months studying a particular victim before making their move. The most skilled among them could drain a soul so subtly that the victim might not even realize what was happening until it was too late. The Darkwraiths also served as agents of recruitment for their covenant, seeking out individuals who might be susceptible to corruption and adding them to their ranks. They looked for people who were already angry, desperate, or morally compromised. Those who might be willing to embrace the dark arts in exchange for power or revenge. Ambitious nobles, fallen knights, desperate criminals, and bitter scholars all proved to be fertile ground for recruitment into the Covenant of Darkness. As their numbers grew and their techniques became more refined, the Darkwraiths began to have a noticeable impact on the broader political and social landscape of Lordran. Cities that had once been prosperous and secure began to experience unexplained declines in morale and productivity. Trade routes became dangerous as travelers disappeared without explanation. The very fabric of civilization began to fray, as the corrupted knights of New Londo spread their influence across the realm. The four kings watched these developments with satisfaction, seeing them as evidence of their growing power and the inevitable triumph of their dark vision. They had succeeded in creating an army of soul harvesters that could operate independently while remaining bound to their will. The covenant of the Darkwraiths had become a weapon capable of bringing entire kingdoms to their knees, not through military conquest, but through the gradual corruption and consumption of their population, spiritual essence. But the very success of the Darkwraiths would ultimately prove to be one of the factors that brought about their downfall. Their activities could not remain hidden indefinitely, and the scale of their operations eventually attracted the attention of forces far greater than anything they had previously encountered. The corruption that had begun in the shadows of New Londo was about to face the light of divine attention, and the consequences would be catastrophic for all involved. Chapter 5. The Abyss Awakens. Beneath the foundations of New Londo, in depths that predated the age of fire itself, something ancient and terrible began to stir. The abyss, that primordial darkness from which all things had emerged before the coming of the first flame, had felt the call of the corruption spreading through the city above. Recognizing the deepest darkness, was drawn to the growing shadow in the hearts of the four kings, and their servants rising from its eternal slumber to embrace its new-found children. The abyss was not merely darkness in the sense of an absence of light. It was something far more fundamental and terrifying. The embodiment of entropy itself, the force that sought to return all things to the undifferentiated void from which they had originally emerged. In the age of ancients, before the discovery of the first flame, the abyss had been held in check by the static nature of that timeless era. But the coming of fire and the establishment of disparity had created cracks in the world's foundations, spaces where the deepest darkness could seep through and influence the course of events. The corruption of the four kings provided the abyss with something it had long sought: intelligent agents who could serve as conduits for its influence in the world above. The fragments of the Lord's soul that the kings possessed made them particularly valuable, as these powerful artifacts could be corrupted to serve the abyss's purposes while retaining their fundamental nature. Through the kings, the abyss could begin to establish a foothold in the age of fire itself. The first signs of the abyss's awakening were subtle, noticed only by the most sensitive inhabitants of New Londo. Shadows began to behave strangely, moving independently of the objects that cast them and lingering in places where no shadows should exist. Temperatures dropped in certain areas of the city for no apparent reason, creating pockets of unnatural cold that seemed to emanate from the stones themselves. Animals became agitated and fearful, fleeing the city in droves as their instincts warned them of the growing danger. the city's architecture began to change in response to the abyss's influence. Stone that had stood firm for centuries started to develop cracks and fissures, not from age or structural weakness, but from some internal corruption that seemed to eat away at the material itself. The very foundations of buildings began to shift and settle as the ground beneath them was hollowed out by the spreading darkness below. Water sources throughout the city became tainted with an oily substance that defied identification. Wells that had provided clean, clear water for generations now yielded liquid that was dark and viscous, carrying with it the taste of despair and the smell of decay. The city's fountains, once sources of beauty and refreshment, became stagnant pools where nothing living could survive for long. The abyss's influence manifested most strongly in the deepest parts of New Londo, particularly in the sewers and underground chambers that honeycomb the city's foundations. These areas became breeding grounds for creatures that had never before been seen in the world above. Beings of pure darkness emerged from the depths, formless entities that fed on light and hope. They were not creatures in any conventional sense, but rather manifestations of the abyss itself, given temporary form by the concentration of corrupt energy in the city. These abyssal manifestations were drawn to sources of humanity like moths to flame. They could sense the life force of the city's inhabitants from great distances, and they moved through the darkness with predatory intent. Unlike the Darkwraiths, who retained their human intelligence and could be reasoned with or negotiated with, these creatures of the abyss were driven by pure instinct. They existed only to consume, to drain away the light and life from everything they encountered. The Four Kings initially welcomed these developments, seeing them as signs of their growing connection to the fundamental forces of darkness. They believed that they could control and direct these manifestations of the abyss, just as they commanded their dark wraith servants. This assumption would prove to be one of their greatest miscalculations. For the abyss serves no master and acknowledges no authority save its own inexorable nature. As the corruption deepened, the very nature of space and time within New Londo began to warp and distort. Certain areas of the city became maze-like, with corridors that led nowhere and rooms that existed in impossible configurations. Visitors to these affected areas reported becoming lost for hours or even days in passages they had walked countless times before. Some never returned at all, vanishing into pockets of reality that had been consumed by the encroaching darkness. The abyss's influence extended beyond the physical realm, affecting the spiritual and psychological state of everyone within its reach. Citizens of New Londo began to experience shared nightmares, visions of a world consumed by darkness where all light had been extinguished. These dreams were not random fantasies. but prophetic glimpses of the future that the abyss sought to create. The psychological pressure of these constant visions of doom began to break down the social fabric of the city, turning neighbor against neighbor and destroying the bonds of trust that had once held the community together. Perhaps most disturbing of all were the changes that began to occur in the city's children. Young people who had been born after the corruption showed signs of being touched by the abyss from birth. Their eyes were darker than normal. Their shadows moved independently, and they seemed to understand things that no child should know. Some began to speak in languages that predated human civilization, uttering words that carried the weight of ancient darkness. These children became living conduits for the abyss's influence, spreading its corruption simply through their presence. The four kings found themselves changing in response to the abyss's awakening. Their physical forms continued to mutate, taking on characteristics that were less and less human with each passing day. The bark-like growths that had begun around their hearts spread across their entire bodies, creating a natural armor that was stronger than steel, but cold to the touch. Their limbs elongated and twisted, becoming more suited to their new existence as beings of darkness than to their former roles as human rulers. More significantly, their minds began to operate on fundamentally different principles. The wisdom and compassion that had once defined their leadership were replaced by an alien intelligence that viewed the world through the lens of entropy and consumption. They retained their memories of their former selves, but these recollections seemed to belong to different people entirely. Creatures whose motivations and desires they could no longer understand or relate to. The fragments of the Lord's soul within the kings became focal points for the abyss's power, transforming from sources of divine light into conduits for primordial darkness. This transformation was not without conflict, as the fundamental nature of these soul fragments resisted corruption. The resulting internal struggle manifested as periods of intense pain and disorientation, during which the kings experienced visions of both their glorious past and their inevitable future as servants of the abyss. The awakening of the abyss also attracted the attention of other dark forces throughout Lordran. Creatures that had hidden in the deepest caves and darkest forests began to move toward New Londo, drawn by the concentration of corrupt energy. Ancient evils that had slumbered since before the Age of Fire stirred to consciousness, recognizing in the city's transformation an opportunity to reclaim their influence over the world. The city became a beacon for everything dark and malevolent in the realm, a gathering point for forces that sought to undo the work of the first flame. The Darkwraiths found their abilities enhanced by the abyss's presence, but they also discovered that they were no longer fully in control of their own actions. The dark energy that flowed through them carried with it an alien will that sometimes overrode their conscious intentions. They might find themselves performing actions they had not planned, following impulses that came from the deepest darkness rather than their own minds. This loss of autonomy was terrifying even to these corrupted knights, but they were powerless to resist the influence that had become so deeply embedded in their souls. The covenant that bound the Darkwraiths to their masters became something more than a simple oath of allegiance. It evolved into a metaphysical connection that linked all members of the group to the growing power of the abyss. Through this connection, the darkness could coordinate their actions with perfect precision, using them as components of a larger organism dedicated to the spread of corruption. Individual Darkwraiths became less important than the collective will of the abyss that moved through them all. As the corruption reached its peak, New Londo began to sink physically as well as spiritually. The ground beneath the city, hollowed out by the spreading abyss, could no longer support the weight of the structures above. Buildings that had stood for centuries began to tilt and crack, their foundations undermined by the growing void below. The city's lower levels were gradually consumed by darkness, becoming part of the abyss itself, rather than remaining in the world of light and form. The four kings made their final transformation during this period, abandoning their human forms entirely to become creatures of pure darkness. They descended into the deepest parts of the city, taking up residence in the heart of the abyss itself. From this position, they could oversee the final stages of their realm's corruption, while enjoying direct communion with the primordial darkness that had become their true master. The awakening of the abyss marked the point of no return for New Londo and its inhabitants. What had begun as a noble experiment in enhanced governance had become an existential threat, not just to the city itself, but to the entire age of fire. The corruption that had started with the four kings' acceptance of CTH's teachings now threatened to spread across all of Lordran, consuming everything in its path and returning the world to the undifferentiated darkness from which it had originally emerged. But the forces of light were not blind to what was happening in New Londo. As the abyss awakened and its influence began to spread beyond the city's borders, it attracted the attention of powers that were both willing and able to resist its advance. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would determine the fate not just of New Londo, but of the entire age of fire itself. Chapter 6: The Knight Artorias and the Hunt for Darkwraiths. In the shining halls of Anor Londo, far above the growing darkness that consumed New Londo, Lord Gwyn observed the corruption of his former vassals with mounting alarm. The four kings, whom he had trusted with fragments of his own lord's soul, had betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way possible. They had embraced the very darkness that the Age of Fire had been established to hold at bay, becoming agents of entropy and corruption. Their transformation represented not just a personal betrayal, but a threat to the entire order that Gwyn had spent millennia building and maintaining. The Lord of Sunlight understood that decisive action was required. The corruption spreading from New Londo could not be allowed to continue unchecked, lest it consume all of Lordran and bring about the premature end of the Age of Fire. But this was not a problem that could be solved through conventional military force. The Abyss and its servants operated according to rules that transcended normal physical combat, requiring specialized knowledge and equipment to combat effectively. Among Gwyn's 4 knights, one stood out as uniquely qualified to face this particular threat. Knight Artorias, known throughout Lordran as the Abyss Walker, had already demonstrated his ability to traverse the deepest darkness without being consumed by it. His reputation as a hunter of creatures corrupted by the Abyss made him the natural choice to lead the campaign against the fallen kings and their Darkwraith servants. Artorias was a figure of legend, even before his involvement in the New Londo crisis. Tall and powerful, clad in distinctive armor that bore the markings of his noble order, he embodied the martial ideals of Gwyn's knights. His skill with a great sword was unmatched, and his unwavering dedication to the cause of light had earned him the respect and admiration of all who served under Gwyn's banner. More importantly, he possessed the rare combination of courage and wisdom necessary to face the forces of the Abyss without losing himself to their corruption. The knight's ability to walk in the Abyss had been gained through a covenant with creatures that dwelt in the deepest darkness, but had not yet fallen to corruption. This pact, forged during his earlier campaigns against the forces of entropy, granted him protection against the influence of the Abyss, while allowing him to move freely through its domain. The exact nature of this covenant was known only to Artorias himself, but its power was evident in his ability to emerge unscathed from encounters that would have destroyed lesser warriors. When Gwyn commanded Artorias to deal with the threat posed by the 4 kings and their Darkwraith servants, the knight accepted the mission without hesitation. He understood the magnitude of the task before him and the dangers it entailed, but his dedication to the cause of light overrode any personal concerns he might have had. The corruption of New Londo represented everything he had sworn to oppose, and he would face it with the same determination he had shown in all his previous battles against the darkness. Artorias was not to undertake this mission alone. His constant companion, the great grey wolf, Scythe, accompanied him as always. This magnificent creature, larger and more intelligent than any ordinary wolf, had formed an unbreakable bond with the knight during his early adventures. Sif's keen senses and natural resistance to corruption made the wolf an invaluable ally in the fight against the forces of the abyss. Together, knight and wolf had faced countless dangers and emerged victorious through their perfect coordination and mutual trust. The knight also carried with him artifacts specifically designed to combat the influence of the abyss. Chief among these was the silver pendant, an ancient treasure of Londo that had been blessed by Gwyn himself. This pendant could deflect the dark magic of abyssal creatures, providing crucial protection against their most dangerous attacks. Artorias also bore weapons and armor that had been specially treated to resist corruption, ensuring that his equipment would not turn against him during prolonged exposure to the darkness. The campaign against the Darkwraiths began with reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. Artorias needed to understand the full scope of the corruption before he could formulate an effective strategy for combating it. He and Scythe moved secretly through the lands surrounding New Londo, tracking the movements of Darkwraith agents and mapping their areas of operation. What they discovered was more extensive and organized than anyone had anticipated. The Darkwraiths had established a network of safe houses and supply caches throughout Lifedrain, creating an infrastructure that allowed them to operate effectively far from their base in New Londo. They had infiltrated numerous cities and organizations, placing their agents in positions where they could gather intelligence and harvest souls without detection. The scope of their operations suggested that the corruption had been spreading for much longer than anyone had realized. Artorias began his campaign by targeting isolated Darkwraith cells, using his superior skill and equipment to eliminate them before they could warn their allies or escape to report his activities. These early engagements allowed him to study his enemies' tactics and capabilities while disrupting their operations on a small scale. He learned that the Darkwraiths were formidable opponents possessed of dark powers that made them dangerous even to a knight of his caliber. The art of Lifedrain proved to be particularly challenging to counter. Darkwraiths could steal the life force of their opponents through direct contact, weakening them while strengthening themselves. This ability made prolonged combat extremely dangerous, as even minor wounds could become serious disadvantages if they allowed a Darkwraith to make contact with an opponent's flesh. Artorias had to develop new fighting techniques that emphasize speed and precision over sustained engagement. As his campaign progressed, Artorias began to attract the attention of more senior Darkwraith commanders. These veteran knights, corrupted by years of exposure to the abyss, possessed power that rivaled his own. They coordinated their efforts to trap and eliminate the troublesome Abyss Walker, setting ambushes and deploying their most skilled agents against him. The conflict escalated from isolated skirmishes to into a full-scale war of shadows. The knight's reputation as a hunter of dark wraiths spread throughout their ranks, making him a target of intense hatred and fear. They began to develop tactics specifically designed to counter his abilities, studying his methods and looking for weaknesses they could exploit. Some attempted to corrupt his equipment through prolonged exposure to abyssal energy, while others tried to overwhelm him through sheer numbers. But Artorias proved to be a more formidable opponent than the dark wraiths had anticipated. His combination of skill, equipment, and determination allowed him to consistently emerge victorious from encounters that should have destroyed him. Each victory weakened the dark wraith network and brought him closer to his ultimate goal: a direct confrontation with the four kings themselves. The knight's successes against their servants did not go unnoticed by the fallen rulers of New Londo. The four kings, now more creatures of the abyss than human leaders, recognized that Artorias posed a genuine threat to their plans. They began to take personal interest in the campaign against him, directing their most powerful servants to eliminate the troublesome knight before he could reach their stronghold. As Artorias pushed deeper into dark wraith territory, he began to encounter manifestations of the abyss itself. These were not creatures in any conventional sense, but rather extensions of the primordial darkness that served as the source of the corruption. Fighting them required not just physical prowess, but spiritual strength. As they attacked the very essence of their opponents, rather than simply their bodies. The knight found that his covenant with the creatures of the deep darkness served him well in these encounters. The protection it provided allowed him to resist the abyss's attempts to corrupt him, while his weapons and equipment remained effective against its manifestations. But each battle took its toll, forcing him to draw upon reserves of strength, and will that even he was not sure he possessed. Scythe proved invaluable during this phase of the campaign. The wolf's natural instincts, allowing the pair to avoid many of the traps and ambushes that the dark wraiths prepared for them. The creature's loyalty and courage never wavered, even when facing horrors that would have sent lesser animals fleeing in terror. The bond between knight and wolf became even stronger as they faced these ultimate tests together. The campaign reached its climax when Artorias finally penetrated the outer defenses of New Londo itself. The city he found was barely recognizable as the prosperous human settlement it had once been. Corruption had transformed it into something alien and hostile. A place where the laws of reality bent to accommodate the will of the abyss. Buildings rose at impossible angles. Shadows moved independently of their sources, and the very air seemed thick with malevolent intent. But the knight pressed on, driven by his duty and his determination to end the threat that the four kings represented. He knew that the final confrontation would test him as he had never been tested before, pitting his strength against enemies who had transcended their original human nature to become something far more dangerous. The fate of the Age of Fire itself might depend on the outcome of this battle, and Artorias was prepared to sacrifice everything to ensure that the forces of light emerged victorious. Chapter 7. The Flooding of New Londo. As Knight Artorias pressed his campaign deeper into the corrupted heart of New Londo, it became increasingly clear that conventional military action would not be sufficient to contain the threat posed by the Four Kings, and their abyss spawned servants. The corruption had spread too far and taken too deep a root for it to be cut away by sword and spell alone. The very foundations of the city had been compromised, transformed into conduits for the primordial darkness that sought to consume all light and life. Reports from Artorias' reconnaissance missions painted a picture of escalating horror. The abyss was not content to remain hidden in the depths beneath New Londo. It was actively expanding its influence, sending tendrils of corruption through the surrounding lands. Villages in the vicinity began reporting strange phenomena. Livestock found drained of life. Wells that produced water black as night, and children who spoke in tongues that predated human language. The infection was spreading, and every day of delay allowed it to claim new territory. In the halls of Annalando, Lord Gwyn convened his most trusted advisors to discuss the crisis. The assembled council included the surviving members of his 4 knights, his most skilled sorcerers, and representatives from the major human settlements throughout Lordran. The debate that followed would be remembered as one of the most agonizing in the history of the Age of Fire, for it concerned not just military strategy, but the fundamental question of how many lives could be sacrificed to preserve the greater good. The reports from New Londo left no room for doubt about the severity of the threat. The Four Kings had progressed far beyond simple corruption. They had become conduits for forces that threatened the very existence of the Age of Fire. The abyss flowing through them was not just another enemy to be defeated in battle, but a fundamental force of entropy that sought to return the world to the undifferentiated void from which it had originally emerged. If allowed to continue spreading, it would eventually consume all of Lordran and bring about the premature end of the Age of Light and Disparity. Several solutions were proposed and debated with increasing urgency. Some suggested a massive military assault, combining the forces of all the loyal kingdoms to overwhelm New Londo through sheer numbers. Others advocated for more subtle approaches, using powerful magic to create barriers that would contain the corruption, while specialists worked to find a cure. A few optimistic voices even suggested that the Four Kings might still be redeemed, that their corruption could be reversed if the right combination of sorcery and divine intervention could be brought to bear. But as the debate continued, it became clear that none of these conventional solutions would be adequate. The abyss was not a force that could be negotiated with or reasoned away. It operated according to principles that were fundamentally hostile to existence itself, seeking always to reduce complexity to simplicity, life to death, order to chaos. The corruption it spread was not a disease that could be cured, but a transformation that changed the very nature of whatever it touched. The most knowledgeable among Gwyn's advisors understood that the situation had passed beyond the point where normal measures could be effective. The abyss had gained too strong a foothold in New Londo to be expelled by force, and its influence was spreading too rapidly to be contained through conventional barriers. Something more drastic was required, a solution that would sever the connection between the corrupted city and the rest of Lordran with absolute finality. It was during the darkest hour of these deliberations that one of Gwyn's sorcerers proposed the ultimate solution. New Londo could be isolated from the rest of the world through the most complete means possible by flooding the entire city, drowning not just the corruption, but everything and everyone within its borders. Water, particularly water blessed by divine power, could serve as both a barrier and a cleansing agent, containing the abyss while purifying whatever it touched. The proposal sent shock waves through the assembled council to deliberately flood an entire city, destroying not just the corrupted, but also the innocent. Seemed like an act of monstrous cruelty that violated every principle the Age of Fire was supposed to represent. The death toll would be catastrophic, encompassing not just the four kings and their Darkwraith servants, but also the countless citizens who had played no role in the corruption, but simply had the misfortune to live in the wrong place at the wrong time. Yet, as the debate continued, it became increasingly clear that this desperate measure might be the only way to prevent an even greater catastrophe. The abyss would not stop at New Londo's borders. It would continue spreading until it had consumed everything in its path. The choice was not between saving the innocent and sacrificing them, but between sacrificing some innocents now and losing everyone later. The mathematics of the situation were brutal but undeniable. Lord Gwyn himself remained silent through much of the debate, his ancient features betraying none of the torment that must have been raging within his divine consciousness. The decision that faced him was perhaps the most difficult of his long reign, requiring him to weigh the immediate certainty of massive loss of life against the potential for even greater destruction if no action was taken. The responsibility for whatever choice he made would rest on his shoulders alone. When Gwyn finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority and infinite sorrow. He acknowledged the horror of what was being proposed, but confirmed that there was no alternative. The corruption of New Londo posed an existential threat to the Age of Fire itself, and extreme measures were justified to prevent its spread. The flooding would proceed, but it would be carried out by volunteers who understood the full magnitude of what they were being asked to do. 3 sorcerers stepped forward to accept this terrible burden. These brave souls, whose names have been lost to history, save for fragments preserved in the most ancient texts, were among the most skilled practitioners of their art in all of Lordran. They understood both the technical challenges of flooding an entire city and the moral weight of the action they were undertaking. Their sacrifice would be remembered not just for its effectiveness, but for the courage required to shoulder such a devastating responsibility. The magical technique required to flood New Londo was complex and dangerous, requiring precise coordination between multiple casters, working with forces that could easily have destroyed them if improperly handled. The sorcerers had to create a magical seal that would contain the floodwaters, while simultaneously channeling divine energy to purify them and enhance their effectiveness against the corruption of the abyss. The slightest error in their calculations could result in failure or worse. Yet the corruption of the flood itself. The preparations for the flooding took several days, during which the sorcerers worked tirelessly to perfect their techniques and gather the necessary materials. They required not just magical components, but also the blessing of Lord Gwyn himself, for the divine power needed to sanctify the flood. Waters could only come from the Lord of Sunlight. Gwyn provided this blessing willingly, understanding that his own participation was necessary to ensure the success of the operation. During this period of preparation, desperate attempts were made to evacuate as many innocent civilians as possible from New Londo. However, these efforts were largely unsuccessful. The corruption had progressed to the point where the city's borders were effectively sealed by manifestations of the abyss. Those who attempted to flee often disappeared into the darkness that had consumed the outer districts, their fates unknown, but presumably grim. The few who did manage to escape carried with them tales of horror that only reinforced the necessity of the drastic action being planned. Knight Artorias was recalled from his campaign against the Darkwraiths as the preparations for flooding reached their final stages. His reports on the situation within New Londo confirmed that conventional military action would indeed be futile. The corruption had advanced so far that the city was no longer recognizable as a human settlement. The very laws of physics seemed to operate differently within its borders, and creatures of pure darkness roamed freely through streets that had once been filled with life and laughter. The night's withdrawal from New London marked the end of any hope that the situation could be resolved through surgical intervention. If even Artorias, with all his specialized equipment and abilities, could not make meaningful progress against the corruption, then no amount of conventional force would be sufficient. The flooding remained the only viable option, however terrible its cost might be. When the moment finally arrived, the three sorcerers took their positions at carefully calculated points around New Londo's perimeter. Their ritual began at the darkest hour of night, when the barriers between the material world and the realm of magic were at their thinnest. Working in perfect synchronization, they began to weave the complex pattern of spells that would breach the underground reservoirs and channel their contents into the doomed city. The flooding itself was both magnificent and terrible to behold. Water poured into New Londo from multiple directions simultaneously, filling the streets and rising inexorably toward the highest towers. The blessed waters glowed with divine light as they encountered the manifestations of the abyss, creating scenes of supernatural beauty. Even as they carried out their grim purpose, the corruption fought back against the cleansing flood. But it was ultimately overwhelmed by the sheer volume of sanctified water and the power of Lord Gwyn's blessing. As the waters rose, they carried with them not just the physical destruction of the city, but also a deeper kind of cleansing. The corruption that had taken root in New Londo's foundations was washed away, severed from its connection to the deeper abyss by the barrier created by the flood. The four kings, trapped in their stronghold at the city's heart, found themselves isolated from the surface world, cut off from their ability to spread their influence to other lands. The human cost of the flooding was exactly as catastrophic as had been predicted. Thousands of innocent civilians perished in the rising waters, their lives sacrificed to prevent an even greater catastrophe. The weight of these deaths would haunt Lord Gwyn and his advisors for the remainder of their existence, a constant reminder of the terrible choices that the responsibilities of leadership sometimes demanded. But the sacrifice achieved its intended purpose. The corruption of the abyss was contained within the flooded ruins of New Londo, prevented from spreading to the rest of Lordran. The immediate threat to the Age of Fire was neutralized, bought with a price that would forever stain the conscience of those who had ordered it. The city that had once been a shining example of human achievement became a tomb, its ruins lying hidden beneath the dark waters that served as both grave marker and prison. The three sorcerers who had carried out the flooding did not survive their ordeal. The magical forces they had channeled proved too much for mortal forms to contain, and they perished even as their spell reached completion. Their sacrifice ensured that the secret of how to reverse the flooding died with them, making the containment of New Londo's corruption permanent. Two of their number departed from the city immediately after the ritual's completion, their whereabouts unknown, but their burden of guilt driving them to seek solitude far from the scene of their terrible deed. Only one sorcerer remained in New Londo after the flooding, taking upon himself the role of guardian and keeper of the seal. Ingward, dressed in crimson robes that matched the weight of blood on his conscience, established himself on one of the few structures that remained above the water line. From this lonely perch, he would watch over the flooded ruins for years beyond counting, ensuring that the corruption remained contained and that the sacrifice of so many innocents had not been in vain. The flooding of New Londo stands as one of the most morally complex events in the history of the Age of Fire. It saved Lord Gwyn from corruption and preserved the Age of Light and Disparity for future generations. But it did so at a cost that challenged every ideal the age was supposed to represent. The decision to sacrifice the innocent to save the many would echo through the centuries that followed, a reminder that even the forces of light were capable of terrible deeds when driven by necessity. In the depths beneath the floodwaters, the four kings endured, transformed now into something even more alien and terrible than before, cut off from the surface world, but still connected to the abyss. They existed in a state of eternal undeath, waiting for the day when someone might be brave or foolish enough to seek them out in their watery prison. Their story was far from over, but it would be told in whispers and legends rather than in the bright chronicles of the Age of Fire. Chapter 8: The Eternal Vigil and the Undead Curse. In the years that followed the Great Flooding, New Londo became a place of haunting silence. Its once bustling streets now lying beneath dark waters that reflected no light. The sacrificial flood had succeeded in its primary purpose. The corruption of the abyss was contained, prevented from spreading its influence to the rest of Lord Gwyn. But the cost of this victory weighed heavily on all who had witnessed it, and the flooded ruins served as a constant reminder of the terrible price that had been paid to preserve the Age of Fire. Ingward, the sole remaining guardian of the seal, had established himself as the eternal sentinel over this watery tomb. From his lonely perch atop one of the few structures that remained above the floodline, he maintained his vigil with the dedication of one who understood that a moment's carelessness could undo all the sacrifice and suffering that had created this prison. His crimson robes, once the proud garments of a respected sorcerer, had become the uniform of a jailer, whose charges were among the most dangerous beings ever to threaten the world. The sorcerer's duties extended far beyond simple observation. The magical seals that contained the flood required constant maintenance, their power slowly eroding over time and needing regular renewal to maintain their effectiveness. Ingward had become a master of these ancient techniques out of sheer necessity, developing an understanding of the magic involved that surpassed even that of his departed colleagues. He carried the knowledge of how to maintain the seals, how to strengthen them when they showed signs of weakness, and most importantly, how to detect any attempts by the imprisoned four kings to break free from their underwater prison. The psychological toll of this eternal vigil was immense. Ingard lived in complete isolation, cut off from human contact, and surrounded by the constant reminder of the thousands who had died in the flooding. The weight of his responsibility was crushing. He alone stood between the corrupted kings and the rest of the world, and any failure on his part could lead to catastrophe on an unimaginable scale. The knowledge that he was essential to the continued safety of all Lordran was both a source of strength and a burden that threatened to crush his spirit. Yet, even as Ingwood maintained his lonely watch, changes were occurring in the wider world that would eventually have profound implications for New Londo and its imprisoned rulers. The Age of Fire, which had seemed so triumphant and eternal, was beginning to show signs of decline. The first flame, that cosmic force which had brought light and disparity to the world, was slowly fading, as it had always been destined to do. With its decline came the emergence of a new curse that would affect humans throughout Lordran and beyond. The undead curse manifested as a gradual loss of humanity, a slow transformation that turned living humans into hollow shells of their former selves. Those afflicted with the curse would die and return to life repeatedly, each death stripping away more of their memories, emotions, and essential humanity, until nothing remained but an empty husk driven by base instincts. The curse seemed to strike randomly at first, affecting people from all walks of life, regardless of their social status, moral character, or spiritual strength. The origins of the undead curse were deeply connected to the fading of the first flame and the approaching end of the Age of Fire. As the cosmic force that maintained the current order of reality grew weaker, the barriers between life and death, light and dark, order and chaos began to break down. Humans, beings caught between the extremes of existence, were particularly vulnerable to these changes. The curse was not just a supernatural affliction, but a symptom of the fundamental instability that threatened the entire Age of Fire. The appearance of the undead curse created new challenges for Ingward in his role as guardian of the new Londo seal. Some of those afflicted by the curse were drawn to areas of concentrated dark energy, and the flooded ruins beneath his watch represented one of the most powerful sources of such energy in all of Lordran. Hollow undead began to appear in the areas surrounding New Londo, shambling remnants of once living humans who were attracted to the darkness contained within the flooded city, like moths to flame. More concerning still was the effect the curse had on those who retained enough of their faculties to actively seek out sources of power. Some undead, particularly those in the early stages of the curse, believed that they could cure their condition by gaining access to powerful souls or magical artifacts. The four kings, imprisoned though they were, still possessed fragments of a Lord's soul, one of the most powerful sources of spiritual energy in existence. The prospect of claiming such power was enough to drive some undead to attempt infiltration of the flooded ruins, creating new security challenges for the guardian sorcerer. Ingard found himself forced to develop new techniques for dealing with these intrusions. Undead were notoriously difficult to permanently destroy, as their cursed nature allowed them to return from death again and again. Traditional methods of disposal were often ineffective, requiring the guardian to develop specialized techniques that could either permanently destroy the intruders or deter them from making repeated attempts to breach the seal. The sorcerer also had to contend with a more subtle but equally dangerous threat: the gradual erosion of knowledge about the true nature of the New London situation. As years passed and the immediate crisis faded from memory, new generations began to emerge who had no direct experience of the events that had led to the flooding. To them, New Londo was simply an abandoned ruin, its dangers abstract and theoretical rather than immediate and visceral. This loss of institutional memory created the risk that someone might attempt to drain the flood and explore the ruins below, either out of curiosity, greed, or simple ignorance of the consequences. Ingard found himself serving not just as a guardian of the physical seals, but as a keeper of historical memory, preserving the knowledge of what lay beneath the waters and why it must never be allowed to escape. The guardian's isolation was occasionally broken by visits from other servants of Lord Gwyn or representatives of the various human kingdoms. These official consultations allowed Ingwood to maintain some connection with the outside world and report on any developments that might affect the security of the seal. However, these visits also served as painful reminders of the normal life he had sacrificed to maintain his vigil, highlighting the personal cost of his dedication to duty. The passage of time brought changes to the flooded ruins themselves. The dark waters that covered New Londo were not simply static pools, but active agents of containment and purification. Over the years, they gradually wore away at the physical remnants of the city, reducing proud buildings to rubble and proud monuments to scattered stones. This process of dissolution was both natural and supernatural, as the blessed waters continued their work of cleansing the corruption that had once pervaded every stone and timber. Yet the four kings endured beneath the waters, sustained by the fragments of the Lord's soul within them and their connection to the eternal abyss. Death, which might have been a release for such transformed beings, was denied to them by the very power they had sought to master. They existed in a state between life and death, consciousness and oblivion, maintaining their essential identity while being slowly worn away by the forces that contained them. The king's imprisonment was not merely physical, but spiritual and psychological as well. Cut off from the surface world and from the spread of their influence, they were forced to confront the full reality of what they had become. The fragments of their former selves that remained could remember their original noble intentions, their desire to serve their people and create a better world. These memories served as a constant source of torment, reminding them of how far they had fallen and how completely they had betrayed everything they had once stood for. The isolation also affected the king's relationship with the abyss itself. While they remained connected to the primordial darkness, their ability to serve as conduits for its influence was severely limited by their imprisonment. The abyss, which had once flowed through them to corrupt the world above, now found itself trapped alongside its servants, contained by the same forces that held the kings themselves. This containment created a kind of stagnation within the flooded ruins, a situation where immense power was present, but unable to express itself effectively. The dark energy that had once spread corruption throughout New Londo now circled endlessly within the confines of the flood, growing more concentrated and more volatile with each passing year. The four kings became focal points for this trapped energy, absorbing and containing forces that might otherwise have found ways to escape their watery prison. As the undead curse spread throughout Lordran, it began to affect even the most remote and isolated locations. Pilgrims and adventurers afflicted with the curse would sometimes make their way to New Londo, drawn by legends of powerful souls and ancient treasures that might cure their condition. These desperate souls represented a new category of threat that Ingwood had to monitor and contain, as their cursed nature made them particularly susceptible to the influence of the darkness trapped beneath the waters. Some of these undead visitors possessed enough residual intelligence and determination to pose serious challenges to the Guardian's security measures. They might attempt to breach the seals through force, subterfuge, or magical means, driven by the belief that access to the Lord's soul fragments possessed by the four kings could restore their lost humanity. Others simply sought to explore the ruins out of curiosity or scholarly interest, unaware of the dangers that their presence might unleash. Ingwood developed a complex system of warnings and deterrents designed to turn away these potential intruders without revealing the full extent of the threat they represented. He used illusions, magical barriers, and carefully placed guardians to create the impression that New Londo was simply a dangerous ruin, rather than a carefully maintained prison. This deception was necessary to prevent the spread of knowledge that might attract even more dangerous attention to the site. The Guardian also had to contend with the gradual degradation of the magical infrastructure that maintained the seal, the spells and enchantments that held back the waters and contained the corruption, required constant maintenance and periodic renewal. As Ingwood aged and his powers began to decline, the task of maintaining these complex magical systems became increasingly difficult and dangerous. The sorcerer was forced to innovate and adapt, developing new techniques that could maintain the seal's effectiveness while requiring less personal energy to implement. He created automated systems that could perform routine maintenance tasks, established backup protocols that could contain breaches if the primary seals failed, and trained a small number of trusted assistants in the basic principles of seal maintenance. Yet, despite all these precautions, Ingwood knew that his vigil could not continue indefinitely. He was mortal, subject to the limitations of age and the wearing effects of constant exposure to dark energies. Eventually, he would need to pass his responsibilities to a successor. But finding someone capable of maintaining the seal while remaining uncorrupted by its influence was an almost impossible challenge. The Guardian's concerns about succession were complicated by the political changes occurring throughout Lordran. As the Age of Fire continued its slow decline, the various human kingdoms were becoming increasingly isolated and suspicious of one another, making cooperation on matters of mutual security more difficult to achieve. The knowledge and resources necessary to maintain the new Londo seal might not be available to future generations if the current trends continued. These worries were not merely academic, as signs of the seal's gradual weakening began to manifest in subtle but alarming ways. The water level in some areas of the ruins began to fluctuate, suggesting that the magical barriers were not maintaining their perfect integrity. Strange lights occasionally appeared beneath the surface, visible only to those with the ability to perceive magical emanations. Most concerning of all, some of the undead who approached the ruins reported hearing voices calling to them from beneath the waters. Voices that seemed to know their names and their deepest desires. Ingwood recognized these phenomena as early warning signs that the containment system was beginning to develop flaws. The four kings, trapped for so many years, were slowly learning to work within the constraints of their prison, finding ways to extend their influence despite the barriers that contained them. Their fragments of the Lord's soul gave them access to power that was difficult to contain indefinitely, and their connection to the abyss provided them with knowledge of techniques that could exploit even the smallest weaknesses in their imprisonment. The Guardian found himself forced to take increasingly drastic measures to maintain the security of the seal. He reinforced the magical barriers with new layers of protection, established additional monitoring systems to detect any changes in the ruin status, and prepared contingency plans for various failure scenarios. These preparations required him to delve deeper into dangerous magical practices, risking his own corruption in order to maintain the safety of the world above. As the situation grew more precarious, Ingwood began to consider the possibility that the seal might eventually fail. Despite all his efforts, the power of the Four Kings was simply too great to be contained indefinitely by any mortal magic, and the passage of time worked against the stability of any artificial constraints. If the seal were to fail, the consequences would be catastrophic, not just for the immediate area, but for all of Lordran. This realization led the Guardian to develop a final contingency plan, one that would require the ultimate sacrifice from whoever implemented it. If the seal showed signs of imminent failure, it might be possible to drain the floodwaters deliberately, allowing access to the Four Kings, but also providing an opportunity for a sufficiently powerful warrior to confront them directly. Such a battle would be incredibly dangerous, with little chance of survival for the challenger. But it might provide the only means of permanently ending the threat they represented. The key to implementing this plan lay in the special properties of the floodwaters themselves. The divine blessing that Lord Gwyn had placed upon them not only made them effective at containing corruption, but also granted them the ability to temporarily protect those who were immersed in them from the influence of the abyss. A warrior who could enter the flooded ruins while carrying sufficient protection might be able to survive long enough to reach the Four Kings and engage them in direct combat. But such a warrior would need to possess extraordinary qualities: the strength to face enemies enhanced by fragments of a Lord's soul, the spiritual fortitude to resist corruption by the abyss, and the determination to sacrifice their own life for the greater good. Finding such an individual seemed almost impossible. Yet Ingwood knew that the alternative might be the complete collapse of the containment system and the renewed spread of corruption throughout Lordran. The Guardian's contemplation of these desperate measures was interrupted by reports of strange activities in distant parts of Lordran. The undead curse was spreading more rapidly than ever before, and some of those afflicted were displaying unusual abilities and motivations. Among these cursed souls were individuals who seemed to be specifically drawn to sources of great spiritual power, as if guided by some external force toward the locations where Lord souls might be found. These developments suggested that the time of crisis was approaching more rapidly than Ingwood had anticipated. The breakdown of the Age of Fire was accelerating, and the barriers between order and chaos were weakening throughout the realm. The seal containing New Londo might not have years or even months before it faced its ultimate test. The Guardian realized that he needed to prepare for the possibility that someone would soon arrive seeking access to the Four Kings, and that his long vigil might be nearing its end. The prospect of ending his isolation was both terrifying and relieving. Ingward had devoted his entire existence to maintaining the seal, sacrificing any hope of a normal life in service to his duty. The thought that his vigil might soon conclude filled him with complex emotions. Fear for what might happen if the containment failed, relief at the prospect of laying down his burden, and uncertainty about whether he had the right to make decisions that could affect the fate of the entire world. As these thoughts weighed upon his mind, the guardian continued his careful observation of the flooded ruins, watching for any signs that the situation was changing. The dark waters remained still and silent, giving no indication of the tremendous forces they contained, or the momentous events that might soon unfold. But beneath that deceptive calm, ancient powers stirred with growing restlessness, and the stage was being set for a confrontation that would determine the future of the Age of Fire itself. Chapter 9: The Chosen Undead and the Key to the Seal. In the darkest hour of the Age of Fire, when the first flame flickered with diminishing strength, and the undead curse spread like wildfire across Lordran, there emerged from the northern undead asylum a figure whose destiny would intertwine with the fate of the Four Kings and their watery prison. This individual, known only as the Chosen Undead, bore upon their flesh the dark sign that marked them as one of the cursed. Yet they possessed a quality that set them apart from the countless hollow shells that wandered the decaying realm. The Chosen Undead carried within their soul a flame of determination that refused to be extinguished, no matter how many times death claimed them, or how much of their humanity was stripped away by the curse. This inner fire, invisible to casual observation, but perceptible to those with the wisdom to recognize it, marked them as a being capable of great deeds and terrible sacrifices. They were driven by a purpose that transcended their own survival, guided by forces, both divine and mysterious, toward objectives whose true significance they might not fully understand. The path that would eventually lead the Chosen Undead to New Londo began with the ringing of the bells of awakening, ancient devices that served as both warning and summons in the failing Age of Fire. The first bell housed in the undead parish, beneath the watchful gaze of twisted gargoyles, called out across the land with its bronze voice, announcing that the time of testing had arrived. The second, hidden in the poisonous depths of Blight Town, and guarded by a spider demon of enormous power, added its silver tone to create a harmony that resonated through both the physical and spiritual realms. The ringing of these bells served as a signal to entities, both ancient and powerful, that a candidate had emerged who might be capable of the ultimate sacrifice required to preserve the Age of Fire. Chief among those who heard and responded to this summons was Kingseeker Frampt, the primordial serpent whose role in the cosmic drama was to guide potential heroes toward their destiny as fuel for the first flame. Fram's emergence from the depths beneath Firelink Shrine marked the beginning of the Chosen, Undead's true journey toward the heart of the crisis that threatened Lordran. The ancient serpent speaking with the authority of eons and the urgency of impending doom revealed the nature of the quest that lay ahead. The chosen undead must gather the Lord's souls, those fragments of the first flame's power that had been divided among the great beings of the age, and use them to gain access to the cave of the first flame, where Lord Gwyn himself waited for his successor. Among the Lord's souls that must be claimed were the fragments held by the 4 kings of New Londo. These corrupted rulers, imprisoned beneath the floodwaters for their betrayal of the light, still possessed the power that Lord Gwyn had granted them in recognition of their wisdom and foresight. To claim their soul would require not just courage and skill, but also the ability to traverse the abyss without being consumed by its influence. A feat that had destroyed countless warriors and would-be heroes. The chosen undead's preparation for this confrontation began with a pilgrimage that would take them to the Darkroot Garden, where beneath ancient trees and forgotten stones lay the grave of Knight Artorias. This legendary warrior, once the greatest of Gwyn's knights and the most skilled hunter of creatures corrupted by the abyss, had fallen in service to the light during his final battle against the spreading darkness. His resting place was guarded by his faithful companion, the great Grey Wolf Scythe, whose loyalty transcended death itself. The battle between the chosen undead and Sith was perhaps one of the most tragic encounters in their entire journey. The great wolf, driven by love and loyalty to protect his master's grave and the precious ring that lay within, fought with desperate courage against an opponent he could not hope to defeat. As the battle progressed and Sif's strength waned, the wolf's movements became labored and painful. Yet his determination never faltered. Only in the moment of his defeat, as his massive form collapsed among the flowers that bloomed around Artorias' tomb, did the true cost of the chosen undead's quest become fully apparent. The covenant of Artorias, claimed from the wolf's body at the cost of such heartbreak, was more than just a magical artifact. It represented the concentrated essence of Artorias' ability to walk in the abyss, the power that had allowed him to face the deepest darkness without losing himself to its influence. The ring would grant its wearer the same protection, but it came with the weight of tragedy and the reminder that even the greatest heroes could fall when facing forces beyond mortal comprehension. With the covenant of Artorias in their possession, the chosen undead was finally prepared to seek out the guardian of the New Lond seal and request access to the flooded ruins. The journey to the ruins themselves was treacherous, requiring passage through areas infested with the restless undead and the vengeful spirits of those who had perished in the Great Flood. The very air around New Londo seemed thick with sorrow and regret, carrying whispers of the thousands who had died when the waters rose to contain the spreading corruption. Ingwood, the crimson-robed guardian who had maintained his lonely vigil for so many years, had been expecting this moment with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The ringing of the bells of awakening had signaled to him, as it had to Frampton others, that the time of decision was approaching. The chosen undead's arrival represented both the culmination of his long watch and the beginning of events that could either save or doom the Age of Fire. The Guardian's initial response to the chosen undead's request was cautious and conditional. Ingeward had spent too many years protecting the seal to simply hand over the means of its destruction to any who asked, regardless of their apparent qualifications or noble intentions. He required proof that the visitor possessed not just the power to survive an encounter with the Four Kings, but also the authority to act on behalf of the forces of light. The test that Ingwood demanded was deceptively simple in its statement, but profound in its implications. The chosen undead must first obtain the Lord Vessel, the sacred receptacle that could hold the combined power of all the Lord's souls. This artifact, currently in the possession of Lord Gwyn's daughter, Gainer, in the distant city of Londo, served as both proof of divine favor and practical necessity for the task ahead. Only someone who had been deemed worthy by the gods themselves could hope to claim the Lord Vessel, and only with its power could the gathered Lord souls be safely contained and transported. The journey to Lando was itself an odyssey that tested every aspect of the chosen undead's capabilities. The golden city of the gods reached through Sen's fortress, and its gauntlet of deadly traps represented the heart of the fading Age of Fire. Here, among spires that touched the clouds and halls that echoed with divine power, the true scope of the crisis became apparent. The city was largely empty, its god inhabitants departed or fallen into deep slumber, leaving behind only illusions and guardians to maintain the pretense of divine oversight. The Princess Gaini, who granted the Lord Vessel to the chosen undead, was herself nothing more than an illusion, a magical construct created to preserve the appearance of divine authority in a realm where the actual gods had long since withdrawn from active involvement in mortal affairs. Yet the Lord Vessel she bestowed was real enough, carrying with it the power to contain Lord's souls and the implicit blessing of the divine order that had created it. Returning to New Londo with the Lord Vessel in hand, the chosen undead found Ingard's attitude transformed from suspicious caution to resigned acceptance. The Guardian recognized the artifact's significance and understood what its possession implied about the bearer's destiny. The time had come to fulfill the purpose for which he had maintained his vigil, to open the way for a confrontation that he he had long dreaded, yet knew to be inevitable. The key to the seal that Ingwood provided was not merely a physical object, but a magical instrument of tremendous complexity and power, created by the three sorcerers who had originally flooded New Londo. It contained within its structure the means to reverse their great working, to drain away the blessed waters that had contained the corruption for so many years. The key's activation would not just open a path to the Four Kings, but would also release them from the constraints that had held them in check, allowing their full power to manifest once again. As Ingward handed over this terrible responsibility, he spoke words of warning and guidance that carried the weight of his years of vigilance. The Four Kings, he explained, were no longer the wise rulers they had once been. Corruption had transformed them into creatures of the abyss, beings whose very existence posed a threat to the stability of reality itself. They would not welcome visitors with diplomacy or reason, but would attack with all the fury of trapped predators who sense the approach of freedom. The Guardian also revealed crucial tactical information about the nature of the imprisonment that contained the kings. The flood waters had not simply trapped them physically, but had also created a temporal distortion that affected their manifestation in the material world. The Four Kings could not all appear simultaneously in their full power. Instead, they would emerge one at a time from the depths of the abyss, each appearance triggering the countdown to the next manifestation. This limitation was both blessing and curse. It prevented the chosen undead from being overwhelmed by facing all four kings at once. But it also meant that the battle would become progressively more dangerous as additional opponents joined the fray. The key's activation required a precise understanding of the magical principles that had created the seal, knowledge that Ingwood shared reluctantly but completely. The process would take time to complete, during which the Guardian would be vulnerable to attack from any remaining Darkwraiths or other corrupted beings that might have survived in the flooded ruins. Once begun, the drainage could not be stopped or reversed without destroying the key itself, meaning that the chosen undead would be committed to facing whatever lay beneath the waters. As the moment of activation approached, Ingwood found himself reflecting on the strange turns that fate had taken. For so many years, he had devoted himself to keeping the Four Kings contained, preventing their corruption from spreading to the rest of the world. Now he was about to deliberately release them, trusting in the power and determination of a single cursed warrior to accomplish what armies and divine intervention had failed to achieve. The irony was not lost on him, yet he understood that sometimes the greatest acts of protection required the greatest acts of faith. The activation of the key to the seal marked the end of Ingward's long vigil and the beginning of the final chapter in the story of the Four Kings. as the blessed waters began to recede, revealing the ruins of New Londo in all their corrupted glory. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of the imprisoned kings, but the future of the entire Age of Fire. The chosen undead, armed with the covenant of Artorias and carrying the weight of destiny on their shoulders, prepared to descend into the depths where ancient darkness waited with patient malevolence. Chapter 10. The Descent into the Abyss. As the blessed waters of the flood receded, revealing the long hidden ruins of New Londo in all their corrupted majesty, the true scope of the devastation became apparent to the chosen undead. The city that had once been a pinnacle of human achievement now lay in ruins, its proud architecture twisted and corrupted by years of exposure to the abyss. Buildings that had once reached toward the heavens now leaned at impossible angles, their foundations undermined by the spreading darkness that had consumed the city from within. The streets that had once bustled with merchants, scholars, and citizens going about their daily lives were now filled with the detritus of civilization's collapse. Broken stones, rusted weapons, and the scattered remains of countless lives bore silent testimony to the catastrophe that had befallen this place. The very air seemed thick with sorrow and malevolent intent, carrying with it the whispers of the dead and the promise of horrors yet to be revealed. The chosen undead's first challenge was not the four kings themselves, but the legion of creatures that had made the flooded ruins their home during the long years of imprisonment. Ghosts, the tormented spirits of those who had died in the great flood, drifted through the empty streets and ruined buildings with murderous intent. These spectral beings were not merely echoes of the past, but active threats, possessed of the ability to phase through solid matter and strike at the living with ethereal weapons that could bypass conventional armor. The ghosts' intangibility made them formidable opponents for most warriors, as normal weapons would pass harmlessly through their forms without causing any damage. Only cursed weapons, or those specifically blessed against spectral entities, could harm these restless spirits, forcing the chosen undead to adapt their tactics and equipment to face this unique threat. The curse that marked them as undead proved to be both blessing and burden in this regard, as it allowed them to perceive and interact with the spiritual realm in ways that living beings could not. Deeper in the ruins, more dangerous enemies awaited. The Darkwraiths, those fallen knights who had served the four kings in their corruption, still patrolled the empty halls and flooded chambers of their former stronghold. These warriors had been enhanced by years of exposure to the abyss. Their already formidable abilities, amplified by the concentration of dark energy that permeated the ruins. They wielded their signature dark hand gauntlets with deadly skill, capable of draining the life force from any opponent they could grasp. The dark wraiths represented a different kind of challenge than the spectral ghosts, where the spirits attacked with mindless fury. The corrupted knights fought with the tactical intelligence and disciplined coordination that had made them elite warriors even before their fall. They used the ruined architecture to their advantage, setting ambushes in collapsed corridors and striking from concealed positions with the precision of veteran soldiers. Each encounter with these fallen guardians served as a grim reminder of what the four kings had accomplished through their corruption. These had once been noble knights dedicated to protecting their city and its people. Now, they were little more than extensions of their master's malevolence, while driven by an insatiable hunger for the souls of the living. Their transformation from protectors to predators embodied the ultimate tragedy of New Londo's fall. As the chosen undead fought their way deeper into the ruins, the corruption became more apparent and more oppressive. The very stones of the buildings seemed to pulse with dark energy, and shadows moved independently of any light source. The boundary between the physical world and the realm of the abyss grew thin in this place, allowing manifestations of pure darkness to seep through the cracks in reality itself. The architecture of the deeper ruins defied conventional understanding, with passages that led in impossible directions and chambers that existed in multiple locations simultaneously. The abyss had twisted the very nature of space within the city, creating a labyrinth where the normal rules of geometry held no sway. Navigating these corrupted passages required not just physical courage, but mental fortitude, as the disorienting effects of the spatial distortions could drive lesser minds to madness. The air itself became increasingly hostile as the chosen undead descended toward the heart of the corruption. Each breath carried with it traces of abyssal energy that sought to penetrate the defenses provided by the covenant of Artorias. The ring's protection was absolute, but not without cost. Maintaining its power required constant vigilance and spiritual strength, draining the wearer's reserves with each passing moment. The final descent to the abyss proper required a leap of faith that embodied both the literal and metaphorical nature of the challenge ahead. At the bottom of New Londo's deepest pit lay an opening into absolute darkness, a portal that led not to any physical location, but to the realm of the abyss itself. To enter this void required the chosen undead to abandon the safety of the material world and venture into a dimension where the normal laws of existence held no meaning. The abyss was not merely dark in the sense of lacking light. It was the complete absence of everything that defined reality. Here concepts like up and down, past and future, self and other lost their meaning. Only the protection of Artorias' covenant allowed the chosen undead to maintain their coherence and identity in this realm of absolute entropy. Even so, the experience was profoundly disorienting, requiring tremendous mental discipline to avoid being overwhelmed by the fundamental wrongness of the place. In this void beyond comprehension, the four kings awaited their challenger. They no longer resembled the human rulers they had once been, having been transformed by their long immersion in the abyss into something that existed at the intersection of matter and shadow. Their forms were elongated and distorted with bark-like skin that pulsed with dark energy, and limbs that had grown to accommodate massive weapons forged from crystallized darkness. The king's eyes, once bright with wisdom and compassion, now glowed with an alien intelligence that recognized no bond of kinship with humanity. They had transcended their mortal origins to become avatars of the abyss itself, beings whose very existence challenged the foundations of the Age of Fire. Yet traces of their former selves remained, buried deep beneath layers of corruption, but still present enough to add an element of tragic recognition to the coming confrontation. The battle that was about to unfold would be unlike any the chosen undead had previously faced. The four kings possessed not just the fragments of a lord's soul that Lord Gwyn had granted them, but also the accumulated power of all the souls they had harvested during their reign of corruption. They were master practitioners of the art of Lifedrain, capable of stealing their opponent's strength and adding it to their own with each successful attack. More challenging still was the temporal nature of their manifestation. The kings could not all appear simultaneously in their full power, but neither would they wait patiently for single combat. They would emerge from the depths of the abyss at regular intervals, creating an escalating battle where victory required not just defeating individual opponents, but accomplishing the task quickly enough to avoid being overwhelmed by superior numbers. The arena in which this battle would take place defied conventional description. The abyss provided no stable ground on which to stand, no walls to provide cover, no environmental features that could be used tactically. Combat would take place in a void where only the opposing forces existed, stripped of all distractions and reduced to its most fundamental elements. The clash between light and darkness, order and entropy, preservation and destruction. As the first of the four kings began to materialize from the depths of the abyss, the chosen undead prepared to face the ultimate test of their quest. Everything they had learned, every skill they had developed, every sacrifice they had made would be put to the test in this confrontation with beings who had once shared their humanity, but had chosen to abandon it in pursuit of power beyond mortal comprehension. The battle for the Lord's soul fragment held by the four kings was about to begin. And with it would come the resolution of a tragedy that had begun with noble intentions and ended in corruption beyond redemption. The fate of New Londo, the future of the Age of Fire, and the destiny of the chosen, undead themselves, all hung in the balance as the final act of this ancient drama prepared to unfold in the depths of the abyss. Chapter 11. The Battle with the Four Kings. In the absolute void of the abyss, where reality itself seemed to bend and twist according to alien laws, the first of the Four Kings began to manifest. The process was both gradual and sudden, as if the being were simultaneously emerging from infinite distance and materializing from nothingness. What appeared was no longer recognizably human, but rather a towering figure of bark-like flesh and crystalline bone, wreathed in shadows that moved independently of any light source. The king's weapon was as corrupted as its wielder. A massive sword that seemed to be carved from solid darkness, its blade serrated with edges that caught and reflected no light. The weapon pulsed with the same malevolent energy that animated its bearer, occasionally releasing wisps of shadow that coiled through the air like living smoke. This was not merely a tool of war, but an extension of the king's corrupted essence, as much a part of the creature as any limb or organ. The chosen undead's first glimpse of their opponent revealed the full scope of the transformation that had claimed the former rulers of New Londo. This being retained the general shape of a humanoid form, but every aspect had been twisted by exposure to the abyss. The king's torso was elongated and covered in what appeared to be bark-like growths that pulsed with internal darkness. Root-like protrusions emerged from various points on its body, particularly around the heart, where the fragment of the Lord's soul resided. Most disturbing of all were the creature's eyes, which glowed with an intelligence that was simultaneously ancient and utterly alien. These were not the eyes of a being that had lost its mind to corruption, but rather those of something that had consciously chosen to embrace a form of existence that transcended human understanding. The king recognized the chosen undead not as a fellow human being, but as an intruder in its domain, a fragment of the upper world that had dared to trespass in the realm of absolute darkness. The battle began without ceremony or declaration, as the first king raised its massive weapon and struck with the force of accumulated centuries of hatred and hunger. The blow delivered with impossible speed, despite the weapon's enormous size, would have shattered any normal defense and claimed the life of a lesser warrior instantly. Only the protection of the covenant of Artorias allowed the chosen undead to survive that first assault. The ring's power creating a barrier against the abyssal energies that sought to drain away life and soul alike. The king's fighting style was a perverse mirror of the noble swordsmanship it had once practiced as a human ruler. The techniques were recognizable. Powerful overhead strikes, sweeping horizontal cuts, precise thrusts aimed at vital points. But they had been corrupted and enhanced by the creature's transformation. Each attack carried with it not just physical force, but spiritual assault. As the king attempted to drain away its opponent's humanity with every contact, the art of life drain manifested in multiple forms during the battle. Direct strikes from the king's weapon could steal years of life in an instant, aging its victim rapidly while restoring the creature's own vitality. More insidious were the grasping attacks, where the king would attempt to seize its opponent and drain their life force through direct contact. These embraces of death were accompanied by a terrible intimacy, as the victim would experience flashes of the king's own memories and emotions, feeling the weight of centuries of corruption and despair. Fighting in the abyss presented unique challenges that went beyond the supernatural abilities of the opponent. The void provided no stable reference points, making it difficult to judge distances or maintain proper footing. The absence of conventional light meant that the battle was illuminated only by the dark energies that radiated from both combatants, creating a constantly shifting tableau of shadow and malevolent gleam. The chosen undead was forced to adapt their fighting style to accommodate these otherworldly conditions. Traditional defensive tactics were largely useless in an environment where there was no cover to seek and no walls to use for protection. Instead, the battle became a deadly dance of mobility and aggression, where survival depended on maintaining constant movement and striking with devastating efficiency whenever an opening presented itself. As the battle progressed, the first king's attacks became more desperate and more varied. Recognizing that conventional sword play was insufficient to overcome the protection granted by Artorias' covenant, the creature began to employ more exotic techniques drawn from its mastery of abyssal magic. Dark energy erupted from its form in expanding spheres of destruction, forcing the chosen undead to time their movements with precision to avoid being caught in the blast radius. The king also demonstrated the ability to project its life-draining powers at range, sending out tendrils of darkness that sought to ensnare and drain any living thing they touched. These attacks were particularly dangerous because they could strike from unexpected angles, emerging from the void itself to assault an opponent who thought they were maintaining safe distance. Perhaps most challenging of all were the king's attempts to corrupt the very space around them, creating zones where the normal laws of physics operated according to different principles. In these areas, gravity might reverse, time could flow backward, or the chosen undead might find themselves moving through space that folded back on itself in impossible ways. Navigating these distortions while simultaneously defending against a supernaturally powerful opponent required a level of mental flexibility and tactical awareness that pushed the limits of mortal capability. The tide of battle began to turn when the chosen undead discovered that the king's massive size and corrupted form, while granting it tremendous power, also created exploitable vulnerabilities. The creature's elongated limbs and bark-like skin, while providing natural armor against many attacks, could be targeted with surgical precision by a warrior skilled enough to identify the weak points in its defenses. More importantly, the chosen undead realized that the king's connection to the abyss, while providing it with supernatural abilities, also made it dependent on maintaining that connection. Attacks that disrupted the flow of dark energy through the creature's form could temporarily weaken its abilities and create opportunities for more decisive strikes. The breakthrough came when the chosen undead managed to land a devastating blow against the area around the king's heart, where the fragment of the Lord's soul resided. The attack not only dealt significant physical damage, but also disrupted the delicate balance between the divine power of the soul fragment and the corrupting influence of the abyss. The resulting conflict of energies created a cascade of internal destruction that began to tear the king apart from within. As the first king's form began to dissolve back into the darkness from which it had emerged, the chosen undead had little time to savor their victory. The temporal mechanics that governed the manifestation of the four kings meant that the second opponent was already beginning to materialize, emerging from the depths of the abyss with the same terrible inevitability that had marked the appearance of its predecessor. The second king was similar in many respects to the first, possessing the same corrupted form and wielding weapons forged from crystallized darkness. However, each of the kings retained traces of their individual personalities from their mortal existence, and these differences manifested in their fighting styles and tactical approaches. Where the first king had relied primarily on brute force and direct assault, the second displayed a more cunning and methodical approach to combat. This king employed defensive tactics more extensively, using its massive sword not just as an offensive weapon, but as a shield to deflect attacks while seeking opportunities for counterstrikes. It demonstrated a better understanding of how to exploit the unique properties of the abyss as a battlefield, manipulating the void itself to create temporary advantages and trap its opponent in disadvantageous positions. The battle against the second king was complicated by the lingering effects of the first encounter. The chosen undead had expended significant energy and resources in the previous fight, and the corrupting influence of the abyss had begun to take its toll. Despite the protection of Artorias' covenant, each moment spent in this realm of absolute darkness drained away small portions of the warrior's strength and spiritual integrity. Moreover, the second king seemed to have learned from observing the first battle, adapting its tactics to counter the strategies that had proven effective against its predecessor. it was more cautious about exposing the vulnerable areas around its heart, more aggressive in its use of life-draining attacks, and more willing to employ the exotic magical abilities that the corruption had granted it. The fight became a grueling test of endurance as much as skill, with the chosen undead forced to maintain constant vigilance while gradually wearing down an opponent that seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment. The king's mastery of Lifedrain meant that even minor wounds could become serious disadvantages if they allowed the creature to make contact and steal away precious life force. The turning point in this second encounter came when the chosen undead managed to exploit the king's defensive tactics against it. By feinting an attack toward one vulnerable area, they drew the creature's guard in that direction, then quickly redirected their assault toward a different target. The resulting strike bypassed the king's defenses and delivered a crippling blow that began the same cascade of internal destruction that had claimed its predecessor. As the second king's form began to dissolve, the third was already manifesting, and with it came a new level of desperation to the battle. This king displayed signs of greater corruption than its predecessors, its form more distorted, and its attacks more erratic. Where the first two had retained some semblance of their original martial discipline, this one fought with the fury of a creature that had completely surrendered to the influence of the abyss. The third king's assault was relentless and chaotic, combining powerful physical attacks with wild applications of dark magic that filled the void with destructive energy. Its movements were less predictable than those of its predecessors, making it difficult for the chosen undead to anticipate and counter its attacks effectively. The creature seemed to care little for its own preservation, throwing itself into attacks with reckless abandon that made it both more dangerous and more vulnerable. The battle reached its most intense phase when the fourth and final king began to manifest before its predecessor had been fully defeated. For a terrifying moment, the chosen undead faced the prospect of fighting two of these corrupted beings simultaneously, a challenge that seemed beyond the capabilities of any mortal warrior. The void erupted with dark energy as both kings unleashed their full power, creating a maelstrom of destruction that threatened to tear apart even the fundamental structure of the abyss itself. In this moment of supreme crisis, the chosen undead drew upon reserves of strength and determination that they had not known they possessed. Fighting with a fury that matched that of their opponents, they managed to deliver a decisive blow to the third king, even as the fourth reached the peak of its manifestation. The destruction of the third king created a brief moment of respite, allowing the warrior to reposition and prepare for the final phase of this ultimate confrontation. The fourth king was the most powerful and the most corrupt of the quartet, its form barely recognizable as having once been human. This creature embodied the full might of the abyss, channeled through the fragment of a Lord's soul, making it a being of power that rivaled the greatest entities in all of Lordran. Its mere presence caused the void itself to writhe and twist, as if reality was struggling to accommodate its existence. The final battle was a contest between two fundamental forces: the divine light that the chosen undead carried within their soul, and the primordial darkness that had consumed the four kings. Each strike exchanged between them carried the weight of cosmic significance, as if the outcome would determine not just the fate of the individuals involved, but the future of the entire Age of Fire. The fourth king fought with the accumulated knowledge and power of all its predecessors, employing every technique and ability that the corruption had granted them. Its attacks came in waves of devastating complexity, combining physical assault, magical destruction, and spiritual corruption, in patterns that pushed the limits of what any warrior could hope to counter. The creature's mastery of Lifedrain reached its peak in this final encounter, as it attempted to drain away not just the chosen undead's life force, but their very identity and purpose. Yet, even in the face of such overwhelming opposition, the chosen undead persevered. Their determination to complete their quest and claim the Lord's soul fragments burned like a beacon in the darkness, providing the strength needed to continue fighting when all hope seemed lost. Each blow they landed against the fourth king chipped away at the creature's defenses, gradually wearing down the corruption that had transformed it from a noble ruler into a monster of the abyss. The climactic moment of the battle came when both opponents struck simultaneously, their weapons meeting in a clash that sent shock waves throughout the void. For an instant, time seemed suspended as the fundamental forces they represented struggled for dominance. Then, with a sound like reality itself tearing apart, the fourth king's weapon shattered. Its crystallized darkness, unable to withstand the concentrated force of the chosen undead's assault. The destruction of its weapon triggered the final collapse of the fourth king's form, and with it came the end of the four kings as a unified entity. Their combined essence, freed from the corrupted shells that had contained it, coalesced into a single orb of dark light that pulsed with the power of the Lord's soul fragments they had carried. This was the bequeathed Lord Soul Shard, the prize that the chosen undead had fought so desperately to claim. As the chosen undead reached out to grasp the soul, they felt the weight of all the tragedy and corruption that had led to this moment. The power contained within the shard was immense, but it carried with it the memories and emotions of the four kings fall from grace. For a brief instant, the warrior experienced the full scope of what these beings had once been, and what they had been willing to sacrifice in their pursuit of forbidden knowledge. The acquisition of the bequeathed Lord Soul Shard marked the end of one of the most challenging battles in the chosen undead's quest. But it also represented something more profound. The four kings in their corruption and eventual destruction embodied the ultimate cautionary tale about the dangers of seeking power without wisdom, of pursuing knowledge without considering its consequences. Their fate served as a reminder that even the noblest intentions could lead to the darkest outcomes when guided by pride and tempted by forces beyond mortal understanding. With the four kings finally defeated and their soul claimed, the chosen undead prepared to leave the abyss and return to the material world. The void that had served as the arena for their battle began to collapse in on itself. The fundamental instability created by the king's destruction, making the realm uninhabitable, even for beings as corrupted as they had been. The warriors' escape from this collapsing dimension would mark the end of one chapter in their quest and the beginning of the final preparations for the ultimate confrontation that awaited them in the kiln of the first flame. Chapter 12. The Legacy of New Londo. As the chosen undead emerged from the depths of the abyss, carrying with them the hard-won bequeathed Lord Soulshard, the flooded ruins of New Londo stood as silent testimony to one of the greatest tragedies in the history of the Age of Fire. The city that had once been a pinnacle of human achievement lay in ruins, its buildings crumbling and its streets empty, save for the restless spirits of those who had perished in the Great Flood. The victory over the Four Kings had ended their immediate threat, but it could not undo the devastation they had wrought or restore the lives that had been lost in the struggle to contain their corruption. The aftermath of the battle left the ruins in a state of eerie quietude. With the Four Kings destroyed, the source of the abyss's manifestation in New Londo had been eliminated, but the scars of their corruption would remain for generations to come. The very stones of the city bore the marks of their influence, twisted and darkened by years of exposure to forces that were antithetical to the natural order. These physical reminders served as monuments to the price of unchecked ambition and the dangers of seeking power without wisdom. In good, the faithful guardian who had maintained his lonely vigil for so many years found himself faced with a new set of responsibilities in the wake of the Four Kings' destruction. The magical seals that had contained the floodwaters were no longer necessary for their original purpose, but the decision of whether to drain the ruins completely or leave them partially flooded presented complex challenges. The blessed waters had served as both prison and purifying agent, and their removal might allow other corrupted entities to take up residence in the vacant ruins. The Guardian's role evolved from active containment to historical preservation and education. With the immediate threat eliminated, it became crucial to ensure that future generations understood what had happened in New Londo and why such vigilance was necessary to prevent similar tragedies. Ingwood became both chronicler and teacher, recording the events that had led to the city's fall and sharing this knowledge with those who sought to learn from the past. The broader implications of the Four Kings' defeat extended far beyond the borders of New Londo itself. Their corruption had been one of the symptoms of the broader crisis affecting the Age of Fire, and their destruction represented a crucial step in the chosen undead's quest to either rekindle the first flame or allow it to fade naturally. The bequeathed Lord Soul Shard they had carried would play a vital role in whatever destiny awaited the warrior, whether as fuel for the flame's renewal or as a component in the emergence of a new age entirely. The story of the Four Kings also served as a cautionary tale about the nature of power and responsibility. These rulers had begun their journey with the noblest of intentions, seeking to better serve their people and create a more prosperous realm. Their corruption had not come through malice or inherent evil, but through the gradual erosion of their moral foundations. When faced with temptations that promised easy solutions to complex problems, the serpent Darkstalker Kaathe had not forced them to embrace the darkness. He had simply offered them choices, and they had made decisions that led inexorably to their downfall. The transformation of New Londo's knights into Darkwraiths represented another layer of the tragedy, showing how corruption could spread through bonds of loyalty and duty. These warriors had followed their masters into darkness, not out of evil intent, but out of the very virtues that had made them exemplary knights. Their dedication to their oaths and their trust in the wisdom of their leaders. Their fate illustrated how even the most noble qualities could become sources of damnation when directed toward corrupted ends. The flooding of New Londo remained one of the most controversial decisions in the history of the Age of Fire, raising questions about the acceptable cost of preventing greater catastrophes. Lord Gwyn and his advisors had faced an impossible choice: allow the corruption to spread and potentially consume all of Lordran, or sacrifice the innocent along with the guilty to contain the threat. The decision they made saved the realm, but left a stain on the conscience of the Age of Fire that would never fully heal. The three sorcerers who had carried out the flooding became figures of both reverence and tragic remembrance. Their sacrifice had been necessary for the preservation of the realm. Yet, the weight of the innocent lives they had taken in the process had driven them to various fates. Two had departed immediately after the ritual, seeking solitude and perhaps redemption in distant lands. The third, Ingwood, had remained to bear witness to the consequences of their actions and ensure that such measures would never again be necessary. The magical techniques employed in the flooding represented some of the most advanced sorcery ever practiced in Elran, combining divine blessing with arcane knowledge to create a form of magic that was both destructive and purifying. The seals that had maintained the flood for so many years were masterworks of magical engineering, designed to contain not just physical water, but the spiritual corruption that had infected the city. The knowledge of how to create such seals was largely lost with the deaths of their creators, making the new Londo incident a unique event that could not easily be replicated. The presence of the abyss beneath New Londo also raised questions about the fundamental nature of reality and the forces that shaped the world. The primordial darkness that had answered the Four Kings' call was not merely another form of magic or supernatural phenomenon, but rather a basic component of existence itself. Its manifestation in New Londo suggested that such forces were always present, lurking beneath the surface of the ordered world and waiting for opportunities to express themselves. The corruption of the Four Kings had implications for understanding the nature of Lord Souls and the beings who possessed them. These fragments of the First Flame's power were not just sources of magical energy, but fundamental forces that shaped the reality around them. The fact that such power could be corrupted and turned to serve the abyss demonstrated that even the mightiest sources of light contained the potential for darkness when improperly wielded or insufficiently guarded. The role of the primordial serpents in these events highlighted the complex nature of the entities that guided the fate of the world from behind the scenes. Darkstalker cult's manipulation of the Four Kings was not an aberration, but part of a larger pattern of interference by these ancient beings in the affairs of mortals and gods alike. Their motivations remained largely mysterious, but their influence on the course of events was undeniable and often catastrophic. The survivors of New Londo's fall, few though they were, carried with them stories and knowledge that would influence the development of magic and politics throughout Lordran for generations to come. Some became wandering scholars, studying the nature of corruption and seeking ways to prevent similar tragedies. Others became advisors to rulers in distant lands, sharing their hard-won wisdom about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of maintaining moral clarity in the face of temptation. The ruins themselves became a destination for pilgrims and scholars seeking to understand the events that had transpired there. The flooded city served as a living monument to the consequences of corruption, its empty streets and collapsed buildings bearing witness to the price of hubris and the importance of vigilance against the forces of darkness. Many who visited came seeking treasure or power, but most left with a deeper understanding of the fragility of civilization and the constant struggle required to maintain order in a world where chaos always threatened to break through. The magical residue left by the Four Kings' corruption created unique phenomena within the ruins that would persist long after their destruction. Areas where the concentration of dark energy had been particularly intense developed properties that defied normal understanding, creating pockets of twisted spacetime where the normal laws of physics operated according to different principles. These anomalies served as subjects of study for researchers seeking to understand the fundamental nature of reality and the forces that could alter it. The ecosystem that developed within the flooded ruins was unlike anything found elsewhere in Lordran. The blessed waters that had served as a containment medium created an environment where normal life could not flourish, but where spectral entities and creatures touched by the abyss could thrive. This unique biosphere provided insights into the relationship between the physical and spiritual realms, demonstrating how magical forces could create entirely new forms of existence. The diplomatic ramifications of New Londo's destruction affected relationships between the various kingdoms and city-states throughout Lordran for decades. The decision to flood the city without evacuating its population created tensions and mistrust that influenced political alliances and trade relationships. Some rulers questioned whether similar measures might be taken against their own realms if they were deemed to pose a threat to the greater good, leading to increased independence and isolationism. The artistic and cultural legacy of New Londo lived on in the works created by those who had witnessed its glory and its fall. Poets, painters, and musicians drew inspiration from the tragedy, creating works that captured both the beauty of what had been lost and the horror of how it had ended. These cultural artifacts serve to preserve the memory of the city and its people, ensuring that their story would continue to be told even after all direct witnesses had passed away. The technological innovations that had flourished in New Londo during its golden age were largely lost with the city's destruction. But fragments of knowledge survived through the writings and memories of those who had escaped. These remnants of advanced magical and mechanical techniques influenced the development of similar technologies in other parts of the realm. Though none achieved the same level of sophistication that had characterized New Londo at its peak, the religious implications of the Four Kings' corruption and the flooding that followed created new theological debates about the nature of divine justice and the acceptable limits of sacrifice for the greater good. Some saw the events as proof of the gods' wisdom and benevolence in protecting the world from ultimate destruction. Others questioned whether any authority, divine or otherwise, had the right to decide which lives were expendable for the sake of preserving the many. The study of the Four Kings' transformation provided valuable insights into the nature of corruption and the processes by which noble beings could be turned to serve evil purposes. Scholars who examined the remnants of their power and the accounts of their fall developed new theories about spiritual resilience and the factors that could protect individuals from similar temptations. This knowledge proved invaluable in training future leaders and magical practitioners to recognize and resist corrupting influences. The economic impact of New Londo's destruction rippled throughout the trade networks of Lordran, as the city had served as a crucial hub for commerce between distant regions. The loss of this central marketplace forced traders to develop new routes and establish new relationships, ultimately leading to a more distributed but less efficient commercial system. Some regions prospered as they took over functions previously served by New Londo, while others suffered from their isolation from the broader network. The psychological impact on those who had ordered or carried out the flooding continued to influence their actions and decisions for the rest of their lives. Lord Gwyn's willingness to sacrifice his own divine essence to kindle the first flame may have been influenced by his guilt over the necessity of destroying New Londo and its innocent inhabitants. Similarly, the few surviving sorcerers who had participated in the ritual were forever changed by the weight of what they had done, dedicating their remaining years to preventing the need for such measures ever arising again. As the Age of Fire drew toward its close, and the chosen undead completed their quest, the story of the Four Kings and their fallen realm served as both warning and inspiration. It demonstrated the heights that human civilization could achieve when guided by wisdom and blessed with divine favor, but also showed how quickly such achievements could turn to ash when corruption took root. The ruins of New Londo stood as a testament to the eternal struggle between light and darkness, order and chaos, hope and despair, that defined the cycle of ages and the fate of all who lived within it. Conclusion: the endless cycle. And so concludes our deep dive into the tragic tale of the Four Kings of New Londo. We've journeyed from their noble beginnings as wise rulers blessed by Lord Gwyn himself through their corruption by the serpent CTH, and the dark arts of life drained to their ultimate defeat in the depths of the abyss at the hands of the chosen undead. We've witnessed the golden age of their city, the spread of darkness through their realm, and the terrible price paid to contain their corruption when New Londo was sacrificed to save the rest of Lordran. The story of the Four Kings serves as perhaps the most potent cautionary tale in all of Dark Souls lore. These were not beings born to evil or driven by malice, but rather individuals who began with the noblest of intentions and the wisdom to rule justly. Therefore, reminds us that corruption often comes not through obvious temptation, but through the gradual erosion of moral foundations. The slow compromise of principles in pursuit of seemingly reasonable goals. The serpent CTH's role in their downfall illustrates the subtle nature of true corruption. He did not force the kings to embrace darkness, but simply offered them knowledge and choices, allowing their own pride and ambition to guide them toward their doom. The art of Lifedrain, he taught them, was presented not as evil magic, but as humanity's birthright, a return to their natural state. This deception worked precisely because it contained elements of truth wrapped in layers of justification that made the unthinkable seem reasonable. The transformation of New Londo from a pinnacle of human achievement to a flooded tomb speaks to the fragility of civilization and the constant vigilance required to maintain order in a world where chaos always threatens to break through. The city's citizens paid the ultimate price for their rulers' choices. Swept away in waters blessed by divine power to contain a corruption they had played no part in creating, their sacrifice saved Lordran, but left a stain on the conscience of the Age of Fire that could never be fully cleansed. The legacy of the Four Kings continues to resonate throughout the Dark Souls universe, influencing events and characters in ways both obvious and subtle. Their story connects to the broader themes of the series: the cyclical nature of history, the corrupting influence of power, the price of knowledge, and the eternal struggle between light and darkness that defines existence itself. The abyss they served continues to threaten the world in subsequent ages, while the methods used to contain them echo in later conflicts between order and chaos. The flooding of New Londo represents one of the most morally complex decisions in the entire Dark Souls mythology, forcing us to consider questions about acceptable sacrifice, the greater good, and the responsibilities of those who wield power over others. Lord Gwyn and his advisors faced an impossible choice, and their decision to sacrifice the innocent to save the many raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of heroism and the costs of leadership in desperate times. Knight Artorias' failed campaign against the Darkwraiths adds another layer of tragedy to the tale, showing how even the greatest heroes can be insufficient to stem the tide of corruption once it has taken hold. His eventual fall to the abyss in Ulysal serves as a parallel to the Four Kings' own corruption, demonstrating that no one, no matter how noble or powerful, is immune to the influence of the deepest darkness when they venture into its domain. The chosen undead's ultimate victory over the Four Kings provides a form of resolution to this ancient tragedy, but it comes at great cost, and with the understanding that such victories are always temporary. The cycle of ages continues, and new threats will always emerge to challenge the established order. The destruction of the Four Kings eliminates their specific threat, but cannot address the underlying forces that made their corruption possible in the first place. The ruins of New Londo, whether flooded or drained, serve as a permanent monument to the events we have explored today. They remind all who encounter them of the price of hubris, the dangers of unchecked ambition, and the terrible choices that sometimes face those who bear responsibility for protecting others. The dark waters that once contained the corruption now rest peacefully. But they carry within their depths the memories of all who perished in service to the greater good. The story of the Four Kings ultimately reflects the broader human condition, our capacity for both great good and terrible evil, our susceptibility to corruption and temptation, and our responsibility to make difficult choices in the face of impossible circumstances. Their tale speaks to timeless themes that transcend the fantasy setting of Dark Souls, addressing fundamental questions about power, responsibility, sacrifice, and the nature of moral decision-making in a complex world. As we reflect on this epic tale of rise and fall, corruption and redemption, sacrifice and salvation, we're reminded of why Dark Souls continues to captivate players and scholars alike. Its stories operate on multiple levels simultaneously, providing thrilling adventure and deep philosophical contemplation in equal measure. The Four Kings of New Londo represent just one thread in the rich tapestry of law that makes this universe so compelling and enduring. Their legacy lives on not just in the ruins of their city or the fragments of their Lord's soul, but in the lessons their story teaches about the nature of power, the importance of wisdom, and the eternal vigilance required to preserve what we hold dear. In a world where darkness always threatens to overwhelm the light, where corruption lurks beneath the surface of even the most noble intentions, the tale of the Four Kings serves as both warning and inspiration for all who would take up the mantle of leadership and responsibility. The cycle continues as it always has and always will. New heroes will rise, new threats will emerge, and new choices will demand terrible sacrifices from those brave enough to face them. But the story of the Four Kings of New Londo will endure, a reminder of both the heights humanity can achieve and the depths to which it can fall when wisdom gives way to ambition and noble purpose yields to corrupting power. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of Dark Souls' most compelling and tragic tales. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the lore of the Four Kings, please consider liking this video for more explorations of gaming's greatest stories. Until next time, keep exploring those epic tales, fellow adventurers, and remember that even in the darkest abyss, the flame of determination can still burn bright.